science fiction. I just wanted to say a few words. First off, I'm really glad you're all here. I'd be even gladder if everybody were here, so I'm keeping my fingers crossed for Helena and for Sophia. So good luck, everybody will be participating. You all, I think, know about the change in the program, that now Helena will be at the end, and Mark has graciously agreed to move himself to our first panel. Anyway, the idea behind this conference, or really symposium, because I figured for the most part we'd mostly be talking with each other, was to actually get together a group of people who have already been thinking about Naучная фантастика from a scholarly and maybe non-scholarly point of view. I personally was really invested in the idea of having a group of people who are willing to discuss this, not just in terms of when a legitimate, prestigious writer deigns to slum into science fiction, or just 2 or 3 authors who are safe, but to really think in terms of genre, and to address perhaps how Naучная фантастика circulates within the broader culture, and of course how differently it circulates from American fantasy and science fiction. I called this fantasy and science fiction in part to split the difference and allow pretty much everything that really could possibly be put in terms of any of these genres, and also to recognize how poor a fit both terms are with Naучная фантастика, which is of course scientific fantasy, which actually possibly allows for a broader, more flexible continuum. And as you all know, one of the things, when you think about this comparatively, one of the things that is really fascinating is we're looking at the development of a tradition of a genre or set of genres that developed not in isolation from Western science fiction, but not exactly in full dialogue either. So you end up with sets of conventions and expectations that really are different from what a hardcore science fiction and fantasy reader in the West might expect. I can say personally, as a hardcore fantasy and science fiction reader in the West, I, to be honest, don't usually enjoy Russian fantasy and science fiction. And that I find fascinating. Why am I not responding to this? And so that's a question I've been asking myself all along. Fortunately, that's not what I'll be talking to you guys about. But I'm sure you'd be fascinated.
Your next blog post.
Exactly. Why I don't like the stuff that I'm reading. Anyway, so the symposium, the conference is divided into 3 panels plus a keynote from Anandita Banerjee, who literally wrote the book on this topic. I'm really pleased we're going to be able to hear that during lunch. But right now we have panel number 1, Transnational Fantasies, Fandoms, Translation, and Genre. And the way I think we'll do this is we'll have a talk, and then we'll have about 10 minutes of discussion, and move on to the next, because I'm not going to try to pretend that I very carefully invited everybody to select the thing so that we have the perfect panel that fits together thematically. No. So instead of saving our questions and pretending everything's all linked, we will talk a little bit after each one, and then maybe at the end, if there are questions that really involve everybody, we can go back to them. But our first speaker, who happens to be right here, is Yvonne Howell. I'm very glad she's right here. And Yvonne Howell is a professor of Russian and International Studies at the University of Richmond, the author of Apocalyptic Realism, the science fiction of Arkady and Boris Strugatsky, not a surprise to anyone here, I believe, and the editor of the new anthology of Russian and Soviet science fiction, Red Star Tales, available
at a decent price.
At a decent price, and most important to me, as an ebook, to anyone who is willing to buy it. I didn't even pirate it. In between those 2 science fiction bookends, she has written on the relationship between science and literature in post-war Czechoslovakia, and on the transformation of early Russian eugenics into Soviet social biology and evolutionary psychology in the late 20th century. So, welcome, Yvonne.
Okay. So, as you can see, I'm starting out here with a gigantic topic. I mean, I'm like leaving books altogether, just talking about the science fiction of, science fictionality of all of cultures, supposedly. And I want you just for a moment, Masha will recognize this slide, contemplate this for a moment. Can everyone see? I don't know am I right in front of my own slides?
No,
Okay.
Okay.
So these slides,
Press play and play F.
oh, like hit this thing? What?
There we go.
Close
No,
it.
there we go.
No,
No, wait.
Well, look at the screen, you're fine.
Okay,
No, look
that's
look
it.
behind you.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay. And if I wanted to, All right, let's just, they're very minimal lists. These are just, okay. There is something familiarly science fictional about the conflation of archaic features, technoscience, ideology, and aesthetics in Putin's Russia today. This has led me to wonder whether the science fictionality of Russian culture, which has been so clearly identified as a unique feature of Russian modernity, ever really went away. And everyone gets that first shout out. And indeed, science fictionality is a unique feature of Russian modernity we've kind of established, but this talk is just an experiment to see, does it really ever go away, or can we talk about this as a paradigm? In other words, I want to suggest that we can talk about the science fictionality of Russian Soviet culture, or cultural patterns, as a kind of useful paradigm that has explanatory power for both 20th and 21st century Russian cultural development. So this is still kind of a binary model, a la Uspensky, that predicts a tension between opposing polarities, but these polarities really are kind of science fictional, right? Between the now and the future, or far future, the local and the cosmic, the human and the transhuman. But in this paper, I want to briefly revisit three key categories of cultural imagining. And there are going to be these familiar categories also to science fiction readers, transcending time, conquering space, and creating the human or transhuman. Because of time and, frankly, brain constraints, my treatment of these categories will be far from systematic, but hopefully somewhat symptomatic. I'll have to leap across decades and representational modalities, but I hope it will provoke some new thoughts about what I'm calling the science fictionality of Russian culture. Okay, so if we take a moment to recall that the characteristic features of Russian Soviet cultural development in the 20th century are an almost exclusive orientation towards the future, sometimes with a reference to the past, but almost no interest or representation of the present. An officially disseminated and popularly assimilated cognitive paradigm through which it becomes possible to assume and expect that reality is universally shaped by technoscience. And we can talk about, which I'll do at the end, a prevalence of discursive modes, whether in the realm of everyday life or education or industrial production and so forth, that allow for a kind of science fictional self-fashioning of one's identity, since the available discourse under late socialism tends to be techno-utopian and oriented towards extending collective mastery over matter, space, and time. So to some degree, I'm relying on the experience of putting together the anthology, which reaffirmed some of our expectations. For instance, that early 20th century science fiction would be stridently future forward. But it also produced some new insights, such as the science fictional cognitive perspective that permeates even the so-called научная фантастика ближнего прицела in the 1940s. So that to me was maybe the biggest surprise, was going into this area or this time period where supposedly there was no science fiction to speak of at all, and finding these stories that were really very interesting, and while they don't talk about the far future, the actual kind of cognitive paradigm they use is very science fictional. And then just to anticipate for a moment, finally I'll show at the end of this paper that in the Strugatsky era of Soviet science fiction, which is pretty much the last 3 decades of the Soviet Union, it seems that the degree to which the Strugatskys began to retreat from and abhor the essentialist grip of binary oppositions in Russian cultural mythology is the degree to which other strains of literary and political science fiction resume the lines of cultural fantasy that construe the world in terms of binary oppositions that must be overcome in some uniquely Russian national synthesis of the material and the spiritual. Okay, so to go back to this, the first little blurb then is kind of about the war period, the 1940s. We have tended to think that science fiction, or the science fictional impetus of Russian modernity, came to a halt after the Great Break, around in the 1930s. Certainly, scholars of Russian Soviet modernism have shown us how fictional, architectural, artistic, and also biomedical fields rushed to transform after the revolution under the banner of science and technology. All human advances would be made possible by and mediated by the new technologies and science. We normally see a retreat from this kind of techno-utopian rhetoric in the late 30s and 40s, but in fact, even in the Stalinist period, I think we can see evidence that cultural mythologies about transcending time, which is really about transcending death, are mediated by technoscience. And so I want to talk about the three, so there are the three stories, so three stories from the kind of 1940s, or key stories from the Stalinist period. I think in the interest of time, I'm just going to mention one of them. If there's more time later and people want to know, I'll talk about the other two. But one of the stories that we translated, in fact, we just translated an excerpt of a long novel that was serialized beginning in 1939 by Dolgushin. It was called Rays of Life, or also Generator Chudies. So it kind of came under two titles. And superficially, yeah, it looks like this completely typical, really non-science fictional, typical of high Stalinism. The war is already starting. There's this completely evil German double agent, and then there's the good Soviet, scientists and so forth. And it's a kind of a spy thriller on a superficial level. But right underneath there, and much more prominently, throughout the story is woven. Everything depends on the hope that through science, and it's described as a science that's very near, almost forthcoming, right? That any moment now, we're going to know how to resurrect people from near death. And so there's this kind of fantasy that these people, that everyone, that people who are dying during the war will in fact be resurrected. And the other, there's another part woven into the whole novel about through electronics and so forth, we're going to be able to start to read minds across great distances. So this kind of seemingly Stalinist era, superficial, evil versus good spy thriller, in fact, is also very much depending on a kind of techno-utopian scientific view of human abilities and of the human future. Okay, so now I'm going to switch topics. This is just a typical, I guess, maybe quote from that Dolgushin novel, right? Right near the beginning. This certainty that life can be resurrected, and in the following paragraphs, he goes on into great detail to explain to you the kind of machine, some kind of defibrillator, some kind of machine that's going to do this. Okay, so now I will move forward, in fact, to the post-Soviet period. So now I'm going to talk about, and I'm kind of shifting categories a little bit just for the sake of organization, to conquering space. And so I want to turn to the post-war period and focus in particular on a more fundamental level of cultural construction, namely the fashioning of subjectivity. In this case, the ideological construction of individual selfhood in the late Soviet period. I'm going to borrow here heavily from Alexei Golubyev's recent dissertation work. I like to call it regifting, not borrowing, but he's a wonderful gift to the field, and he's just written this really interesting dissertation. So Golubyev focuses on the role of material objects and the material environment in shaping Soviet subjectivity. In other words, he offers an alternative to the traditionally logocentric view that emphasizes how the Soviet subject writes or performs its selfhood in studies of diaries and autobiography and performative versus genuine speech acts and so forth. In Golubyev's dissertation, he's interested in the objects. I'm so logocentric, I have to have some words up there so I can remember where I am. The objects that served as temporal and spatial coordinates in Soviet society, because it was at the center of these coordinates that Soviet people found their selfhood. So he's looking at the link between Soviet materiality and selfhood. Concretely, the relationship between model rockets, airplanes, radios, urban basements, timber architecture, television sets, etc., as the object coordinates of the self's position in national time and space. So in this section, I will focus on what I see as the science fictionality of Soviet material space as it is revealed, at least to me, in his account. So I should say, Alexei bears no responsibility for this interpretation. But what I'm seeing, among other things, in the the picture that he reveals is, again, even in the post-war period, something that we could talk about this embedded kind of science fictionality of cultural coordinates. So Bolovyev's dissertation demonstrates that from the time of the Khrushchev reforms and onwards, an obsession with technological objects as a characteristic feature of the Soviet person was actively promoted by school education, mass media, and the state network of hobby groups, Rushki. As one article in the journal Modelist Konstruktor put it, this is a quote, if you were seriously interested in space engineering and exploration, if you have chosen your life path from a model rocket to a spaceship, remember that this is a long and demanding path. So note the particular material objects from a model rocket to a spaceship that act as the reference points between which Soviet teenagers were encouraged to build their life paths and their biographies as Soviet socialist citizens. And this kind of self-fashioning was not just for boys. Beginning in the Khrushchev era, Soviet artists and writers working in various genres, but especially, of course, in popular science and science fiction, created multiple representations of women taking part in the socialist conquest of outer space. We have countless pictorial and rhetorical examples depicting women as full participants in the socialist conquest of national, international, and outer space, thereby overcoming all sorts of natural and social limitations. Ultimately, the technocratic, productivist language of Soviet culture found expression in the cultural fantasies of Soviet intellectuals who dreamt of the complete subordination of the material world to human will. I've written elsewhere about Genrikh Altshuler, an engineer and inventor and theorist of creativity, who also wrote science fiction stories under the pen name Altov. So Altshuler designed a complete pedagogical psychological system to train ordinary citizens how to inventively transform the material world around them. He called his system TRIZ, Теория решения изобретательных задач, which he eventually expanded into his even grander theory of Теория развития творческой личности. And if you want to join your local TRIZ club, this stuff, it has American, Australian, etc. branches. It's on the web. You just click there. So, TRIZ, as well as but it was very prominent in the 80s, right? As well as this widespread and officially supported cult of amateur engineering, right? The building model airplanes and so forth. These things show the importance of material objects for the cultural definition of proper Sovietness, both in terms of individual and collective selves. At the center of this definition stood mastery over space, achieved through technological objects. So we're talking now about the 1970s and 80s. Boulder brings the vast popularity and near ubiquity of amateur engineering journals and clubs back into our view of late Soviet culture. Devotees of Modelist Konstruktor, Техника молодежи, катеры, яхты, that was a good journal, Это вы можете, right, read about building yachts, boats, cars, planes, and radio control devices. This magazine will tell you how to build, I went a little bit too far, okay. Where's my, okay, these magazines, I don't know where the slide is, will tell you how to build real small airplanes, helicopters, motor gliders, which will take you up to the sky. As for the future conquerors of the ocean, this magazine will supply you with blueprints and technical characteristics of yachts, motorboats, etc. So even though most people never actually built most of this stuff, so we have huge circulation of these magazines. Most people are just reading them, no one mostly builds this stuff, but we're struck by the discursive patterns which promote the ongoing conquest not only of Soviet space, but of all the space beyond, right? The sky, the oceans, etc. So, in short, the work of Altshuler and these kinds of magazines crystallizes a persistent current in the Soviet cultural mythology. It demonstrates that creation in the Soviet context implied a Promethean vision of the transformative human role in a world waiting to be transformed. This vision, in turn, implied that the normative Soviet subject should be a rational and free actor capable of manipulating and reconfiguring matter in any possible way. Altshuler was emphatic about the value of science fiction as a literary genre for the development of this creative personality. And he insisted in these TRIZ workshops that people also, not only were they learning to model and build things and solve problems of invention, but they had to read and write science fiction. So now we have a two-way effect. The cultural paradigm is science fictional insofar as it is a culture oriented towards a technologically enhanced future. And vice versa, it requires science fiction as a form of literature to train people to define the future as a moment when the material world is flexible and subordinate to human will. Science fiction thus allows for the visualization of the relationship between humans and machines as symbiotic. So we will rely on technology to pave the way to communism, or maybe even to advance Putinism, but in order to do so, people have to turn themselves into technologically literate, scientifically creative personalities. Which then brings us to the very last part, which is creating the human, or the transhuman. Okay. I think I'm okay on time. In 1965, at the early peak of the Strugatskys, this is the last part, at the early peak of the Strugatskys' official favor with the regime, they were afforded a working holiday at one of the writers' colonies that belonged to the Writers' Union. They were delighted with this token of their success and set off to work on a new novel. As soon as they started, they had a massive writer's block, and the resulting writer's block precipitated a revelation that turned out to be fundamental to the larger story of their intellectual influence. According to Boris Strugatsky, the idea of a sentient, fertile, and febrile matriarchal forest planet called Pandora was born at this time. The resulting novella was initially published, as you know, as Ludika na Sklonie, and then banned. Its companion piece, Skaska Troika, was also briefly published, then banned. And the unauthorized appearance of these books caused the Strugatskys a lot of problems. Okay, together the twin pieces depict two evolutionary polarities. The overwhelmingly female, biologically polymorphic, relentlessly absorbent, inarticulate forest represents one version of alterity. Unlike the superficially similar forest worlds depicted in Ursula Le Guin's The Word for World is Forest and James Cameron's Avatar, the Strugatsky's forest is not figured as a potentially Edenic society living in harmony with nature. It is organic, yes, but also archaic, inchoate, and morally repugnant. As you recall, the forest stands in stark contrast to the Bureau that tries to control it. The Bureau is hyperverbal, entirely male-dominated, and committed to overcoming all obstacles with technological fixes. It is harshly hierarchical, rigid, and morally repugnant. In other words, in creating the forest and the Bureau, the Strugatskys seem to have created two archetypes of the social evolutionary endpoints that they detested but might be powerless to avert. Now, bizarrely, today's Russian neoconservatives reread the Strugatskys as a vindication of their own vision of the necessary third way that Russian transhumanist philosophy offers the world. And thanks to Masha Engstrom, who happens to be sitting here today, we have some ideas. So she's been kind of delineating the basic course of the neoconservative argument, which includes these kinds of statements, right? When we reread the Strugatskys, we become convinced there is something much more that is inexplicable than explicable in them, even though their fans have break through every page of their work. For instance, why is a civilization ruled by women depicted as the greatest evil threatening mankind? One would think that a liberal would fear something different than the weaker sex. Well, they do. So according to the new Russian neoconservatives, the forest world, in their interpretation, really represents the whole bundle of Western neoliberal values that Russia must reject. So the abolition of patriarchal values, abject devotion to green policies and sustainability, inverted or warped gender policies, democracy understood as minority rights, and so forth. In this interpretation, the forest archetype represents a foolish rejection of progress in the name of eco-harmony with animals and earth, and it is somehow construed as the endpoint of decadent and corrupt Western ideology. According to these same neoconservative analysts, the Bureau depicted by the Strugatskys lacks a creative spiritual component, but in a certain sense it at least points in the right direction. And they seem to be rereading the Strugatskys, the later Strugatskys, where the Strugatskys portrayed biologically, technically, and spiritually superior Ludini, that those super kind of enigmatic super people developed in their later works, is taken as a desirable model. In the new Russian transhumanist platform, science and technology will give us the superpowers of the Ludini, along with the proper Orthodox Christian consciousness that is recommended. So, and you can find this vision and motives to join the movement at this website. I'll wrap up by saying we can say that there is something enduringly science fictional about the construction of Russian cultural paradigms, beginning from the beginning at the end of the 19th century, and apparently holding on to this moment. So, thank you.
Thank you. We have some time for questions and comments. Come on.
Lipovetsky. Thank you very much for very interesting paper, but I have the following question. So why did you completely eliminate the dimension of social engineering, which was always at the center? So you're talking about subjectivity, techno-utopia, but social engineering, engineering of societal mechanism is not taken into consideration. And maybe as a comment, when you talk about art, I think it's quite telling, as you showed, that they were, and this entire culture of modeling. So these models did not imply real things, right? So the magazine Yachty Petera didn't suggest that anybody would ever have a yacht, yeah, right? And so it was the complete world of sort of parallel reality of little models, and therefore it was rather it's rather, in my interpretation at least, falls under Yurchak's category of living vне, rather than sort of creating the future. It sort of escaped from the current condition, but not into the future, into the parallel world of modeling. And with art of you certainly know how he was persecuted by other sci-fi activists. Of course, there was lots of anti-Semitic things going on there, but certainly his groups were also perceived as a form of living vне, as a form of very tight community where not the future was modeled, definitely not the communist future, but some kind of intellectual survival mechanism were produced.
But there's still, I think the only thing there's still, of all the different possible forms of kind of living vně, right? Yeah, I understand people are reading these modeling things kind of like, I don't know, I want to call it modeling porn or something, right? I mean, you're just kind of, you're not really maybe going to build it. But what was striking though still is even in those magazines, and of course Outshooter is a kind of an extreme example, but that seemingly fairly, impetus to somehow conquer space and often time, but like the spatial, that sense that it's always about moving further out beyond, kind of going beyond our spatial limitations, beyond even our national limitations, right? It's loose, yeah, but I would say, I guess in part of my mind, and I haven't really filled this out, but if you would compare it in some sense to other cultures, right, similar kind of hobby types of things and the discourse of that kind of hobbying and imagining in other cultures, my sense is that it would be different. Yeah. I can't see, but someone has it.
Dina Habayeva, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. I would like precisely to ask you a question about how different, to your mind, Soviet science fiction is compared to, say, American, French, or English of the time, because this obsession with technological objects, this mastery over space and time, this is the categories with which I would easily characterize American fiction of the 50s and 60s, or French science fiction. So I wonder what specifically Soviet do you see in the Soviet fiction?
I'm trying to say that it's not just in fiction. It bleeds right over into actual way of understanding yourself, right? So in some ways, in the very rudimentary way that this kind of takes the place of religion.
So are you saying that
or
science fiction...
Or other civic kind of...
Yeah, so your thesis then is that science fiction kind of expresses Soviet subjectivity. Is this what you're saying? And if I may continue over, I'm really sort of interested in this contemporary focus on the objects. Objects becoming the major kind of methodological way for us nowadays to look at, matters, at whatever scientific subjects. And I wonder what, to your mind, objects bring new to the way how we understand the world. Because objects are very stubborn, and space rockets or TV sets are very similar in the American or Soviet culture. They function probably differently, but it's more subtle, and you need this logocentric discourse to describe it. So I wonder how you see the heuristical value of objects over.
I don't feel like that's even what I can speak to. I mean, it's not, to me, that seems like this is a whole other question. Yes, it's a new shift, and we're seeing a lot of object kind of materiality, new dissertations now, but I don't actually have anything to say about that. What?
I have a very quick, thank you, a very quick comment on Dina's question. I had a stepbrother who's now retired in his 70s who was a passionate model builder as a child and got a job at Ball Brothers, and he built models of telescopes and stuff. So because people couldn't imagine what they would actually look like out in space, so he would build models that Ball Brothers was going to construct. So there are times when, in the West as well, but certainly in the West, it led right to doing the work of space exploration.
Could I comment a little bit? In Soviet environment, it was much easier to apply it to whole society. You just make ukaz, decree, and that's in all high institutions and schools. They will be doing the same thing. In Western society, it's not that easy. So probably that's the difference between if in Politburo someone read some kind of novel oriented to brighter future, he could develop some kind of ideas and apply it.
Which apparently happened concretely,
Yes,
right?
yes,
Often.
yes, what
And
you're
that's just
saying.
not the case in the United States. Anyone who grew up in the United States, in kind of my generation,
it's
I mean,
not
you just
possible.
don't have, and my father happened to be a scientist, but that you have no sense that you're growing up in this world where there's this concept, where it's all about the future. And I mean, it's not a particularly scientific kind of culture, really. Eliot, so I would see there's just these differences. This is very, kind of in 20 minutes jumping from one thing to the other. But there is certainly a difference also in the objects, just in the landscape, even today, right? But certainly when in the 70s and 80s, when you lived in the Soviet Union, there is a palpable difference between Soviet culture and American culture, others, right? And it has something to do with being inflected through this kind of utopian techno-scientific vision, it seems to me.
I want to say something about objects. It seems to me that one thing that science fiction and fantasy, particularly science fiction, can do is allow for the consideration and circulation of objects on a whole spectrum that on one end includes commodities and consumption, but also goes all the way to fetish object and allows you to interrogate the nature of objects really, really well, like Philip K. Dick does in Ubik, where you actually see things, where you have a line of descent, of evolution of the object. So I think we have a mode that really allows us to interrogate this well. And then about the comparative aspect, I kept thinking as I was listening to your talk about Thomas M. Dish's book, The Stuff Our Dreams Is Made Of, where he basically talks about science fiction inventing the future, not in the kind of cliche way, oh, it predicted, oh, it didn't predict, but that the mode of science fiction allowed for a whole range of imaginative discourse that made it possible to think of certain things in the United States, and therefore, in Western culture, and therefore really defines the way we live, and that it's fairly similar to what you're talking about, except that predictably, what you're talking about sounds more focused, and what Dish is talking about sounds more accidental and consumer-based, but it does seem to be something that can operate in a whole variety of science fictions. I think our last comment, and then we'll probably need to go on. Yes.
Okay, Olga Bukina. I just want to return back to what Mark was talking about, because science fiction as a whole, at least in the 70s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, worked just exactly like all this krужки, the place where you can get out of the Soviet reality into the future, past, or, past was, historical fiction was read for the same reason. And that kind of would be very interesting to see how much of that already exists in a previous epoch, or it's just kind of like 70s with the post kind of Stalinist, post Khrushchev kind of despair, I would say. There's no real future, because my point is the show is kind of failed, and now the only thing we are stuck with is the dream of parallel society, and that's where Strugatsky kind of found their niche. Maybe I'm jumping way ahead of the whole discussion, but I would love you to comment on that.
I'm not sure I understand. But yes, certainly there's this resurgence, right, in the 1950s, as the Soviet, in that kind of reinvention, right, of socialism after Stalinism. It could have been reinvented in a lot of ways, and it seems to me that, again, at least roughly, it takes this very science fictional, it takes its cue almost from this genre, right? That last attempt to let's have socialism work. It's going to work with the application, finally, of technology, cybernetics, renewing this dream of getting to outer space, and in general, kind of conquering space and time, whether it's in biomedical efforts or in other things. And it seems to me it kind of seeps all the way up through to the highest political structures, which in that sense would make it a little bit different, although maybe not always different. I don't know what was behind that whole Star Wars thing that we yeah. But yeah, absolutely. I think it's completely, the palpable, right, the resurgence is in the 60s, 70s of this kind of science fictional romanticism in a way. So.
Well, I'd like to thank Yvonne for opening up so much intellectual time and space for us, and I wish we had more real time to discuss her paper at the moment, but I'm sure we're going to go back to all of these issues as we keep going, so thank you.
Okay.
I'll need you just to help me plug in the,
Sure.
plug in the memory stick.
Okay, sure, no problem. Okay. Yeah. This is like contemporary theater where we change the set.
But I can talk while we're doing it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then, while we're doing this, I will introduce you.
Super.
Okay, so this should work.
So I wanted to say, I think another difference is the pervasive anti-intellectualism of American culture, that I think in this culture, science fiction has always appealed to the out group of people wearing glasses, which is certainly how I got into it. I discovered that if I pulled the book off the shelf at the library that had a little starship on it, I was probably going to enjoy it. And so wound up reading a lot of hard science fiction, which then fed into my tastes in Soviet and East European science fiction.
This is your drive.
Yes, super. So it's the one that says, naming the future slides, PowerPoint.
Good. So,
It's going to come up. I think it's just,
you can close this
I'll
one.
close this one.
So in the meantime, I'll introduce Sibelan Forrester, whom I believe you've been introduced to many times in the course of this past hour, let alone in your life of reading. Sibelan Forrester is a professor of Russian at Swarthmore College and has been teaching a course on Russian and East European science fiction since 2014.
Sorry, Eliot, help.
But
It's all
science,
new, I'm creative.
science fiction, actual technology. This goes to show that you can still be a humanist.
This is, yes, you can.
And study science
Close
fiction.
this one and close the lines. I didn't bother to close. Super. There we go. Super. It's that. Yes, super. Wonderful. Okay, sorry.
No problem. So in addition to science fiction, your other interests include poetry, folklore, and gender and women's studies. And actually, she was quite technologically capable, having been web mistress for AWSS for many years.
That's right, and for Atzel.
And for Atzel, yes. I just love saying web mistress. So.
Yes, and Helena Dashima, who is not yet here, commented that I should wear fishnets and high-heel boots to be the web mistress. That's true. I would say that I would look better in the menu at Eliot.
Well,
anyway, thank you very much for that introduction. This is part of a bigger project I got interested in, and again, you can tell from Eliot's final comment that I teach at a small liberal arts college, and so I get to do a little bit of everything. Part of a bigger project on how science fiction circulates in translation, and also what happens to the second world, quote unquote, in the world tradition of science fiction. That in fact, how do we have specialists who actually work on something with some background knowledge, and then how does Lem get taken out? How do the Strugatskys, to a lesser extent, but still get taken out of their context and applied? How is Zamyatin applied without knowledge of anything except a little bit about Stalinism, perhaps, which isn't really relevant to we. But in any case, the topic here is a much smaller topic. I'm really zooming in, especially compared to Yvonne's very broad-reaching galactic approach in the first paper, and just looking at how names work in works of science fiction. And I'm focusing on the 20th century because there's a bigger body of translations, and that's one of the ways I got into the topic. Also looking more at elite science fiction writers, elite just meaning people, particularly in the 60s and 70s, that Whole Macmillan series was marketed to libraries as beautiful hardbacks, often by quite good translators, although not always, and marketed as this is literarily significant. It's not just pulp, right? This is important. We should be buying this and reading it, and then those very volumes became available on Amazon as used books later. So just a quick background to the data I'll be putting up with my slides. Science fiction is projecting a future, and it does so not just with the Suvinium Novum, but with all of the surrounding details. And I would argue that personal names are one of the most intimate parts of surroundings. They behave in particular ways in different languages. Think of students who read Russian novels and are horribly frustrated when Alexei turns out to be Alyosha too. And the tradition of speaking names in literature, I think, is especially important in Slavic languages where the etymology is much closer to the surface than, say, the etymology of a word in English, which might be French, might be Latin or Greek. Does Latin or Greek help you if you're just a general reader, and so on. And I'm going to include Karel Čapek and Stanislav Lem in this survey. First of all, because the data work for them too. The things I found in their work. And second, because I would argue that translation made them part of the Soviet-Russian system of fantastika. So I was struck as a graduate student in the late Soviet period, getting my Kamkin catalogs. Here's this Lem guy who keeps showing up. His name doesn't sound Russian to me, but very easily available, certainly in the mid to late 1980s, and Čapek as well. Probably Čapek for political reasons more, but that Vajna Salamandrami was there in translation and easily available. And the larger thesis is that science fiction only unfolds its full transnational potential in translation. But I won't go back to that thesis. I would, though, mention an interesting sideline to my argument that we should be looking at Čapek and Lem and other, maybe not that many other Central European writers. István Csicseri-Ronay argues in an article that I have in my footnotes that Central European science fiction is exceptional in not coming from an imperial position, that it's coming from a subordinate position, and yet one that had industrialism. It had all of the technological givens, highly educated scientific elite going into the 20th century, all of the givens to make an important tradition of science fiction, but not one that came out of grand ambitions for anything more than just national sovereignty, perhaps. So in any case, what I'm doing in this little project is comparing the use of names in near-future science fiction, and it's not Belisian Priciala so much, it's more kind of 200 years out, 300, 500 years out, not more than that, with far future science fiction, which would be multiple centuries, or even, as in Lem's Siberiad, God knows how many millions of years. Concluding, as you wouldn't be surprised to hear, that the far future science fiction works much better in translation than the near future science fiction, again, because of the way, I'm looking at Anglophone translation, not other languages, but because of the way English works, and I suspect some other languages too. So the first case I'm going to look at is Čapek's famous RUR, just threw up some of the names, written in 1920, published in 1921, and it's set in or around the year 2000. So again, near future science fiction. Yvonne Klima points out in his nice introduction to one of the English translations available that the variety of ethnic and professionally suggestive names of the human beings makes them representative of all humanity, which of course in 1920 meant all of Europe. So I did not go back to the Czech. I believe Helena Glory is not Helena Glory in the original, but most of these names are exactly like that in the original. So there's a German sounding name, there's a Norse sounding name. Čapek is making this apply to a broad range of people. And so there's a certain appearance here that continues to show up of multinational technocratic society. And I would compare it to the story I heard in AP Chemistry many years ago of Niels Bohr's famous lab. He had all these wonderful physicists working with him, kind of postdocs. And World War I began, and they all had to go back to their respective national territories. Somehow were called home for the draft because they were of that age in their 20s. And then he fretted over how one of them, the French one, might have shot the German one, who were such good buddies in the lab back in the good day. It's interesting to compare. I'm not going to go over these in detail because there's not time, but you can draw your own conclusions. And if you know the play, you know who's who. Right. One of my students discovered, and I was embarrassed not to have known this, that in earlier translations, Bussmann, and I guess in the original, is identified as a Jewish character that disappears in later versions. So there's an interesting question of how we retroactively want it to feel the way it felt in the original, right? Not to be anti-Semitic. It's interesting to compare these with the strong presence of nationally significant naming in the barely future science fiction work, War with the Newts. If you haven't read Čapek's War with the Newts, go read it now. Buy it on your way home from this conference. It's just wonderful. Čapek devotes considerable attention to the behavior of various nationalities with parodic versions of famous names. And my favorite is the Soviet a politician who's quoted just briefly, whose name is Molotov. And his name resembles the Czech for salamander, Moloch, but also clearly recalls Molotov, right, why you laughed. And then the use of famous names, including figures such as Arturo Toscanini or Betty Davis. So he has a whole section of quotes where famous people are asked, what do they think? Do the salamanders have souls? Toscanini says if they don't like music, of course, they don't have souls. And it's striking today, how many years later, almost 80 years after the book was written, to see how many of these figures are still important. I recognize Arturo Toscanini, right? He hasn't disappeared from world culture. The initial action of that novel seems to emerge from a humorous name-based misreading of the Czech Captain Van Toch as a Dutchman, Van Toch, and the deployment of national cliches in the characters is reminiscent of Dubravko Ugrishic's 1988 novel, Fording the Stream of Consciousness, which is not science fictional, but also funny and very recommended. I won't give you a slide for every work, but in some cases just hop quickly over them. In Stanisław Lem's Tales of Pirks the Pilot, Powieści o pilocie Pircie, 1968, Pirks' schoolmates sound mostly Northern European. So again, you have this kind of Starship Academy where it's a technocratic but very male elite. Once he's in space, he encounters many Russian names, which is entirely plausible for a near future program in space, but also a number of English, French, German, and Scandinavian names. The final story, Terminus, involves the Captain Mommsen, which to me was vaguely reminiscent of polar exploration and suggests, I don't know whether there's been work on this outside of the Slavic and East European context, but polar exploration narratives with these terrifying dying in the cold as a source for, in this case, the ill-fated Coriolanus spaceship has crashed. They have only limited oxygen, it's also very cold, and they're gradually dying and sending each other Morse code messages. There's another interesting subtopic, Morse code as a way of saving yourself, which I think is a very Boy Scout oriented. And I certainly ran into plenty of that in my little library books with the rocket ship logo on them. Ethnic belonging is overlaid on two characters who perished on the moon. Both of them are Canadian. So this is again in Pirks the Pilot. One has a French name and one has an English name. So interesting, right? Canadian ethnicity being defined in a way that's actually rather typical of the way Canadians think of themselves. Pirks, of course, does not suggest any definite nationality, and that's another thing that shows up with these, the creation of a science fictional hero. You can kind of pull them out of that, all of the kind of cliches you're mobilizing and make them more interesting to a broader range of readers, I think. In Lem's Solaris, and I should have made a slide, but you know Solaris, right? The main characters are Chris Kelvin, whose last name resonates with science, giving its use for conveying temperatures in space, and it's pretty much in space that you bother to use Kelvin as opposed to Celsius, although it's given in honor of someone whose name was not Kelvin. He was Lord Kelvin, but his name wasn't Kelvin. So there's this weird yes you are, no you're not aspect that I think is psychologically appropriate too. The, did I make this? I did make this. Never mind. Sorry, I didn't make this. It was too small. Snow in the original translation from the French is actually snout. And if you read the original translation, you thought, why does he say people call me Ratface? But if his name is Snout, it makes perfect sense, right? So Bill Johnson's translation is now out. It's only available on Kindle as far as I know. So unless you can make your students buy a Kindle book, you can't teach with it. But much better in that sense. He's really going from the original Polish. Sartoriusz, the last name means tailor. I don't know whether that's relevant, I didn't think so, but then Gibarian, who's dead when Kelvin arrives, is Armenian. And Kelvin's late companion, Hare, or Rhea in the first English translation, has no last name, and her first name to me doesn't suggest any commonly known national origin as well. So Kelvin sounds vaguely English, right? The others have vaguely sort of European sounding associations. But Rhea's resemblance to the Greek goddess Rhea may suggest a general idealized femininity rather than specific national belonging, which I think would be right down the line with Lim. These names suggest, too, an international cast of characters brought together by fortuities of scientific education and meritocracy. Now, the series of names in the presentation of solaristic science, which is one of my favorite parts of Solaris, suggests both a worldwide scientific meritocracy, and again, I'm thinking of Niels Bohr's lab. It really is based on what actually happens when you just pick the best physicists, and a community of science that gradually gains members of different nations and ethnic groups. In the case of solaristic science, you don't see any women there. That's lamb, what can I say? The list starts off with English, German, and French names, eventually adds some Russian names, then some Greek or Polish names, and it ends up with Failenga, Hoenmin, Ngalia, and Kavakadze. And I should have made the whole list because it's fascinating to see how it passes over time. You really have this almost realistic vision of science being accessible to different ethnic groups. Showing that participation in the debate over Solaris has spread even more broadly. This inclusion of non-Western scientists in the overall project, parallel somewhat to that of the 20th century, adds verisimilitude to what is in any case a very persuasive display of pseudoscience. Arkady and Boris Strugatsky's noon 22nd century, Poldin 22 wiek, 1961, sets up their universe. The story begins on Mars with 4 characters, a Russian, a Canadian, a Ukrainian, and a Jew, Lazar Mendel, who might also hail from the USSR. The school depicted in several of the stories features tons of Russian names. That makes sense that you'd have kids in a school close to where they come from, but also Nguyen Phu Dat, clearly Vietnamese, and Gurgenidze, very Georgian sounding name. And there's a big bronze bust of rocketry pioneer Konstantin Tsiolkovsky in the lobby. So this is an interesting kind of what would happen if you had a Soviet rocketry school, really, given that they're bringing in people from brotherly socialist nations to study with them, but not too many, just the odd one. In another story, we meet Walter Suronyan, sort of Anglo-Armenian, hard to say. The preponderance of Russians remains throughout this collection, and indeed in most of the Strugatsky's work, when it's set on Earth in Russian spaces. If it's not in Russian spaces, then you get a different percentage that's also kind of very similar. There are almost always a few people present, however, from somewhere else. Once they're out in space, for example, Boulder, this is again in the 22nd century, speaks Russian, but he throws in an aber now and then to remind us of his German background, not only ethnic but also educational, and he's really irritating. So the aber kind of underlines how irritating and just what a Croatian or Serbian would call it pizzaism. It's a pickiness based on pubic lice. So anyway, this echoes David Bellos's, not the pubic lice, but the fact that he's throwing in a very common German word that you would never say aber if you were actually, I mean, you would have learned the Russian word for but, right? It's used all the time, but it echoes David Bellos's suggestion that little tokens of foreignness often suffice to create an atmosphere, and that readers can really like that. You read the aber, and you think, that's in German. And it confirms Potter's Germanness along with his pomposity, his tendency to repeat himself, and his love of taxonomy. And it makes the reader feel good for having learned or recognized a bit of real German. So I'm going to skip a little bit ahead over my comments about Far Rainbow, Raduga, right? Interesting, again, variety of characters. Not only do they have different ethnic backgrounds expressed by their last names, mostly Russian, but plenty of other stuff, some French, some Japanese. There's a moment where Mark Falkenstein, who's one of, I guess, the engineer of the rocket ship, is speaking Japanese to Leonid Garbovsky so that Mikhail Sidorov, who's sort of the mayor of the city, won't understand him, and Garbovsky says, don't bother, Sidorov knows Japanese. So here's a wonderful future educational system where everybody's learning Japanese as a kind of third or fourth language in which to communicate. And skip over that a bit. There's interesting also, and kind of tokenizing, and yet nonetheless representation in Barioka Raduga of African names, East Asian names. There's a Frenchman, a Greek man. Other names include Hassan Alizadeh, Lufun Chan, and Gaba, who's one of the zero testers. He's an African who has no last name that we know of, or any more specific ethnic identification. So typically kind of African is parallel to Japanese as something having ethnic weight, that they're not going to start necessarily giving you more specific background. And sometimes these international characters come with a stereotypical feature. So poor Alizadeh has a hooked nose, which in one scene gets punched because you can't mention a nose unless it gets punched by the end of the play. The Strugatsky's Roadside Picnic, set in Canada, you may be thinking of that one. Given that it's a surrounding reality where you see it's not explicit that it's in Canada, but there's a Royal Air Force or something, so fairly clear that it's North American-ish and it's not the United States. Most of the names are Anglo and French, but we have a couple of Russians, and one of them, of course, Kirill Panov, is one of the only positive characters in the novel. Even after his death, his scientific works continue to appear in print with the little black border around his name, as if to underline that he, unusually in this community, belongs to genuine scientific progress, as opposed to this kind of commercialized military-industrial use of the stuff they're finding. So in any case, we're meant to perceive the national character of the names and to read the mix of tendencies by seeing this future society as at least somewhat less nationalistic and somewhat more cosmopolitan, or you might say cosmospolitan. In socialist era science fiction, the obligatory multi-ethnic starship crew can suggest tacitly that it's a general socialist feature, especially if in the story the characters are speaking Polish or Russian, but also know Western European languages, English, French, German, fill in the blank. One exception to the function of names in this book, and I think it's because it's so much earlier a work in these books, is an earlier piece of Russian science fiction, Alexander Bogdanov's 1908 Red Star, and I've put these up here but won't talk about them in too much detail. We have a few Earth names, Leonid, the hero, and then his friends back in Russia, but the only Martian names we hear all sound Finnish, Netti, Menni, Enosterni, and indeed then Leonid's lover Netti gives him a Martian nickname, so it's Lenny. Doesn't it sound Finnish to you? And of course, then it turns out that their rocket ship takes off from a Finnish lake. And so here's Bogdanov trying to minimize the grammatical gender in the names of these Martians. So he picks Finnish, which does not express grammatical gender, and has names that don't, because it works so well to convey this trait of the Martian language and sounds very alien to a Russian ear. So the easiest way to imagine a language without grammatical gender is to pick one that you already know about. Of course, Finland was part of the Russian Empire until 1917. Alexei Nikolaevich Tolstoy's much less impressive take on Mars Aelita includes Martian names and toponyms that are vaguely based on Aztec. These characters are highly differentiated by sex, but the Martian words convey an exotic touch and not much more. There's not really, I think, much more said in these speaking names. So now I'm switching over to the distant future. Of course, the first example is Andromeda Galaxy, a first example in so many ways. And these names are really off the charts in terms of what they're saying. The fact that the whole name is used, you don't get nicknames, that everyone's saying vui to each other. It's a step back from gender in certain ways. Mostly, there aren't.
That's where they got Darth Vader.
Oh yeah, it seems pretty, I'm not sure that Lucas read it, but somebody might have said, oh, there's this quote.
There was a
it has to be. How could you possibly? Is there an article? If there's an article on that, please tell me, I want to cite it. But in any case, here the characters choose their own names. When they reach a certain age, very few pick names with recognizable ethnic associations. There's a Chinese archaeologist, Liao Lan. Forgive me if you can speak Chinese, I can't do the tones. There's a Japanese pearl diver who has chosen a Japanese name. So you can recognize your own past. Darvieter, at one point we learned, I'm trying to do the socialist realist pose, has a Russian background, right? And so he's picked, but it's not a Russian name. Nobody would be named that. I mean, it's a comic book. Well, it's a Russian word, but it's not a Russian name. Dar. Daria, yes, but
Daria.
so recognize, but it's not Daria. So the point here is we're getting very far from something we would recognize. Something we would recognize. And they're using word roots often rather than words, like erg. Okay, you can tell the guy's full of energy, right? But he didn't say energia, it's erg, because he can recombine in any direction. He's a free radical. And gender remains here. The women's names end in a, but other ways they don't behave like Russian names. Moreover, the characters are all using the formal second-person pronoun to address one another, the grown-ups. And this creates considerable cognitive estrangement for a Russian reader, although that difference disappears in the English translation. And somebody please, either I will or somebody translate this properly. There's a new version by, I bought it because I was so excited, but it's like a vanity translation project, and her name is Vanya K or something, and she, very disappointing, not worth, do not purchase it unless you're going to study second-grade translations of science fiction, and that's a cool topic, but unless that's your topic, don't purchase it, I'll loan you mine. We're evidently supposed to feel a bit of distance from these characters, so the estrangement of the names emphasizes that this is a very distant future. We don't live this way. It's not the way we do. And they continue to be referred to by both names as we learn to know them better. So in fact, for your students, they'll love it because there's no Alyosha here. They're always what they are. And in any case, the use of the formal pronoun perhaps as expressing respect for the individual. And there's a notable step toward gender equality, although Yvonne, of course, still gives a somewhat essentialist presentation of sex and of race. He has no interest in sexuality, although later chapters do give an attentive and realistic look of how things go when a couple breaks up. So a little emotional sensitivity coming from Yvonne in that relationship. The names need only to be translated or even just transliterated to make them just as unfamiliar to the reader and just as defamiliarizing as they are in the original. How am I doing for time? I'm getting excited and not paying attention. All right, next, Zamyatin's groundbreaking and seminal dystopian novel Lee. I put 1924 because that was when it was first published, of course it wasn't. And weirdly, again, first published in English. The characters are named with numbers, although each has an alphabetical letter that conveys a great deal about the character. The same tactic is picked up by later dystopias, such as THX 1138, which was George Lucas's directorial debut in 1971, and set in the 25th century. The setting for Lee is much less clear in terms of its time. The 25th century, I think maybe that's the dividing point between near and far for this purpose. Among other things, the names reveal gender, the vowels are for women, the consonants are for men, and the idea of being named with a number is a cognitive novelty for readers today, although we've learned to feel that that is a horrible dystopian thing. Right? So even your social security number creates all this anxiety, right? The possibility of identity theft through the social security number. You don't want to be reduced to that. It's offensive when your doctor asks for it, right? But when D503 feels affectionate about one of the other characters, of course he's the narrator, he leaves off the number and just says, my dear O, my good friend R, right? I. And just writes the letter. In translation, the names can be left more or less the way they are in the original, although in the existing English translations you lose the original's distinction between Russian and Latin letters. In particular, the Latin D is not as close as Cyrillic D to the Greek letter delta, which is used in physics to symbolize change and therefore is most appropriate to D503's transformation in the course of the work. A scientifically literate reader would immediately start to think, okay, this person is going to be on a different gradient or have a different curve from the other characters. So whoever does this next translation of we might want to introduce a few Greek letters, including delta, so that the resulting layer of meaning will be apparent to the reader, and rather than having to be kind of archaeologically recreated on the blackboard by the professor. And people know, our students know the Greek letters, right? For teaching purposes, it would be perfectly. I mean, they all know, they know fraternities, right? Other works of science fiction set in the distant future, and this is where I'm going to wind up, use names to convey meaning that don't really need to be translated, but they're not a bit familiar to the reader as names. So I was looking at Lem's Siberia, Tiberiada, 1965. I have that edition somebody gave me. They're falling apart Polish. So I've been able to handle its pages. And it set some indeterminate number of centuries, or more likely millennia, in the future. Now this wonderful set of inventive and funny names often feels like something out of Rabelais or out of Monty Python. Maybe a combination of those two without the vulgar, I mean, maybe there is a vulgar underpinning there. Some of them are very similar to the versions given in Michael Kandel's brilliant translation of the book on the right below, over here. And Kandel, of course, has a PhD in Polish. So here's a symbol of what you can get with that advanced higher education. So here, these are pretty similar, right? You can see the resemblance. In this case, he's changed and added umptor because it just sounds so good. Then there are some that are somewhat adjusted. So the Stili Pips, right, Stalozi, Genialo becomes genius, Exilius, so exile becomes Excelsius, so kind of playing with the phonemes there for something similar. And some of them are completely different in order to preserve and convey the humor. So Patvorik, Migerik become atrocitus and ferocitus. You know, what did this mean anyway, right? This is just as good. Pantarctic, isn't that wonderful? Like Antarctic becomes Prince Pantaloon, sort of like Pantaloon. Or Holocaust, the long one. So he's got this wonderful equivalent portmanteau name. And then my very, very favorite, King, and then Okurtsush means something rather like cruel, and cruel is the pronunciation. So Kandel flips it and sort of has his cake and eats it too by giving you King Cruel, which to me, for the English reader, mobilizes drool and Kool-Aid. So it's the perfect undercutting, insulting, talking name, but it sounds like cruel, right? So you also get phonetically, maybe even subconsciously, although you realize by the end of the story, this guy's just bad news. He has a receiving hall shaped like a skull, and the light comes in from the empty eye holes of the skull and lands on the person he's interrogating and threatening to throw into the pit. And says, of the pit, I don't know how deep it is, and I don't know how many inventors have fallen in, but when they fall now, the crunch happens much sooner. And this also becomes redundant, and Mark, you'll appreciate the toponym Table Mesa. I grew up in a place where there was a Table Mesa. Mesa means table in Spanish, right? But you know, these Anglos thought, God, that looks like a table. To call it Table Mesa. Table. The realm of Meteri, Heteri, Eteri, et Ceteri becomes Inika, Minika, Mainika, and Moaka. Right? So you get the Sigmi, same effect, and so on. So in any case, very quickly, more on how names work in science fiction. I read and wish I could recover some science fiction writers' comment on how you can do similar things with very small changes in the wording. And he said, imagine a future in which you're describing all these horrible things happening, and then the final thing is the president came out to speak to reporters and she said. So this is getting closer to not being a science fictional future, but there was an example of how one little thing can make you realize that you're not in the world you grew up in. Here's just one example from a less well-known science fiction author, Olga Larionova, her 1969 story Obvinение, the Accusation, which was translated by Mary Ginsburg. So Reggie, the character, says, Я был на Нина, когда там разыскивали группу Авакумовой. Все перемерзли, никого не удалось отразить. So he's saying, I was on the asteroid Nina when they were looking for Abakumova's group. They all froze to death. We didn't manage to save any of them. So this party of Earthlings in the story Obvinение is composed of all men. One is a French name, one is English or maybe Scottish. One sounds Scandinavian, and our narrator's name isn't given, but he's speaking Russian, so we can guess whatever we like. But the mention here of Abakumova's group shows that women could lead exploratory parties into space, and two, could pay the ultimate price because she and her group freeze to death. So the message is not quite as clear in translation. Would a reader from a language with less gender marking know that Abakumova is a woman's name, or that Karenin's wife should be called Karenina? Perhaps this could be clearer with a slight expansion into Abakumova and her party, for example. Would make that more clear. So I would answer that this science fiction is speaking to the reader of today and suggesting different ways of being in a community than the ones from before. Hence, it includes all these visible signs of national or ethnic or gender categories, plus the novum, whatever it is, drawn from new technology or distant placement or interesting physical territorial traits, or practices that are expressed in new, either wholly new, logistic, or repurposed words. So we can read the names from our present state of knowledge to perceive a truly integrated world in the future, or not, and we can see that as the triumph of socialism, which of course brings in everyone and makes them equal, or we can see it just as a world we'd rather be living in. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions and comments.
I welcome questions and comments, although I left my knitting on my seats.
Anastasia?
Yes. So listening to this, I was sort of struck by the way that you're talking made me think of the original series of Star Trek, which
Yes.
I'm guessing you're familiar
I
with.
almost said, but please tell us the story. It's a wonderful story.
Well, Star Trek, it's a very exploratory, it's set in this utopian future where they all set out to explore space. And it's sort of the socialist utopian future. They've gotten rid of money and poverty and everything. And so they're all in this spaceship exploring space. And one of the big, very groundbreaking things in the 1960s in this TV show was the incredible diversity of the crew of this ship. You had a black woman, an Asian man, Chekhov, who was a Russian ensign, and an alien character, who obviously all had names that fit with their ethnicities.
Except for Dr. Spock, which says how to diaper your children.
Well, yeah.
Sorry, go on.
When I told my parents about Dr. Spock, they were very confused about who I meant. But sort of, I was wondering if you could speak to maybe the similarity or the relationship between the way that names are used in the text you've been speaking about and the way that names and diversity is used in Star Trek's utopian future.
I'm very happy you brought that up, because the other story I heard about, the first version of Star Trek, which is the only one I know anything about, and I didn't watch it, right? I was a very nearsighted, alienated, I just crap on television. But apparently in the first season especially, the background was also very diverse. They really made a point of having a black actor walk by, or a black woman in the mini skirt with the legs, right? So,
They did,
right.
yeah.
And that became less common as time went on, because it just cost more to find those people. They weren't part of the standard cast call. And so that's one interesting thing, that they really went into it with the idea of showing whoever's future this is. Is it a capitalist future that's just the sort of war on poverty capitalist future where everything is okay and it all works the way it's supposed to work? Or is it some kind of, really socialist future? I mean, looking back at the 1960s, I have to say, Richard Nixon looks a whole lot better than I ever thought he was gonna. As a person who grew up thinking, listen to him retire as or abscond or abstain or abdicate. As I was walking to babysit, every house had this show blaring out of their doors. It was summer and the doors were open. But I think it's a certain kind of tokenization too. There's one black woman, there's one, it's not like, and then you have the Scot. So when did a Scot become equivalent to a black woman as something we want to represent on the show? And we have the Southern guy who, when he gets a little drunk, his speech becomes more, broadly Southern and drawly. So there's a funny, similar to the African being equivalent to the Georgian or something. Africa's huge. And I should say, in fairness to the Strugatskys, there's also a pygmy scientist who happens to be a specialist in off-world diseases that threaten human explorers. So they do sometimes zip down. But I have to say, putting a pygmy in as your one example of a specific African ethnicity is almost, let me pin this butterfly here on the wall. So there's also an episode that I did not see but read about, and those of you who watched Star Trek can hop in and correct me, because I'm doing this by hearsay, where they run into a Russian starship, and they have a drinking game, and they're trying to drink each other under the table, and the Americans win when they offer water to the Russians.
I don't think
Maybe
that's
it's
an
Klingons?
episode. There's an episode where the
Klingons.
Scottish guy drinks some aliens under the table.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure they're aliens, but the Scottish guy drinks them
Right,
under
so
the
there's
table.
folklore about Star Trek
But the
episodes.
Klingons, the Klingons, the first series were Russians, and the next series they were Japanese, basically.
Oh, yeah, I mean, the aliens are sort of metaphors for all of the nations that...
All the nations that we don't like, right?
Well,
So I think Star
yeah.
Trek's having it both ways. In any case, what I mean with this story is that they're having it both ways, that they're integrated, and yet the hero is this incredibly white bread, oh my God, white man who, the women are also supposed to love, even though he's just such a loser. And sorry, I'm saying this as someone who never watched it.
You got it.
And yet on the other hand, isn't it better than, so much of the crap that was Gilligan's Island? I mean, diversity? It's intelligence diversity. We have sort of okay professor, and then...
I mean, if I could interject just really quickly,
Yes.
This white male protagonist you're speaking of, he actually, in my view, undermines a lot of the stereotypes of the kind of white male protagonist you would have had on television at this time, because he's actually not romancing women all the time. They're romancing him, but he sort of just ignores it. He doesn't really engage in things like that. And he's also the character who was part of the first interracial kiss on television with African American woman.
When they're both being brainwashed, of course.
Well, of course. And also,
You have to
know,
hedge your bets really
Yes.
intensely.
But he also
Funny
has
story,
an
yeah,
intense
that-
romance with Spock.
Yeah,
Sorry.
Sorry?
He also has this intense relationship with Spock.
Yeah,
Okay, so
slash
don't get me
fiction.
started on that one yet.
Okay.
The interracial relationship between a human and an alien, that's truly progress.
It's truly progress. Well, no, I think indeed. But the thing is, Star Trek, the first series, clearly represents all kinds of progress that's similar to what's going on in some of these other works of science fiction, with certain indicative twitches that show that you can't just plunge into it. And I think, I took down my slides, but thinking back to Yefremov, Elise Thorson did a wonderful paper at a conference. I'm not sure whether she's published it. I think she called it Space Race, and then is looking in particular at Ven Mas, the African main character among the main characters of Andromeda Galaxy, who he can't resist saying, walked with the tread of the African crossing the belt. I mean, he can't leave that out. When Ven Mas is walking, it always zaps back in a way that, and Ven Mas to me doesn't, and I'm sure to you, doesn't sound African. The guy's not like stressing his ethnicity the way some of the particularly Asian characters in the novel do. But he can't, somehow he, you know, it's so cool that the guy is there and that he's important and that he plays this important role, and yet he's just stuck being African no matter what else happens. He can't just be human the way. Yeah, Eliot.
But listening to this, thinking about how in the evolution of Anglo-American science fiction, especially the sort of low-rent and televised version, how so much, how almost as shorthand, the names so often were names that could be like your brand of television. Like think of on the Croneheads, it was Beldar. Things ending in R and or, all of these things that actually try to sound like they have no ethnicity, and that in fact their ethnicity is science fiction. And it's not until New Wave science fiction and later that you actually have the writers who are really preoccupied with the language, who are really giving a lot of thought to this. I mean, even on Star Trek, there was a stupid naming convention that every Vulcan's name, every male Vulcan's name, had to start with an S and end with a K, which is really gonna, I mean, that's almost as bad as everybody in South Korea being Kim. You know, that's really not gonna give you that much
A whole lot of
room
diversity.
to-
Like, oh, that
The
guy.
male names that
that-
begin with S, the female names begin with T, but
Yeah.
like the other thing is in Star Trek is that sort of you have an entire planet that just shares one culture, like the Klingons.
They
The
all
entire
do.
planet is the Klingon culture, the entire planet is the Vulcan culture. And then, you know, you look at our human society here and, you know, obviously we're not.
Yeah, you go 2
know,
blocks over, we're not, yeah.
Yeah, which.
I want to jump on Eliot's comment just very quickly and say, that reminds me of a lot of Russian folktales where the Tsar has this weird non-Russian name, right? So, Sultan. So I wonder, I mean, I think that goes deeper than just
Pixar.
crap science fiction.
But the names struck me. I didn't remember one of the Strugatsky, there's Walter Saranyan, which of course American writer Sarayan.
Ah, maybe this
And,
is a,
and would be interesting to see other names because I can't really, but we have Chekhov in Star Trek.
Yes.
It's sort of like cultural, hello, you know.
yeah, but
And
also
then interesting-
Chekhov.
Yeah, but it's obviously
Chekhov.
association.
Let me pull out my
Uh,
credit card.
would be interesting to see how many, at least at Strugatsky, how many of these names
Are we
are recognized by Russians because everyone loved Sarayan in exactly that same time, you know. And I'm sure will be more of this kind of jokes because for Strugatsky, I bet it's jokes, you know, to allude to particular known cultural kind of important person from another culture. But it's not about translation. I don't know how you even convey that in translation.
So I actually think we have
Thank
to
you.
move on. Thank you so much. This was great. So our next speaker probably needs no introduction. Everybody knows him by at least one of his names. Mark Lipovetsky, who spies under the name of Mark Liederman. I could tell you stories about Mark Lipovetsky, but I'll just, and I won't read the entire list of his published books because we're supposed to only spend about half an hour now. But he's professor and chair of the Department of Germanic and Slavic Languages and Literatures at University of Colorado Boulder. He's the author of more than 100 articles published in the US, Russia, and Europe, 8 books, co-editor of 15 volumes of Russian literature and culture. Basically, if it happened in Russian literature, he's written on it. It's including paralogies, performing violence, Charms of Cynical Reason, Russian literature since 1991, So I think even as we speak, another book is probably coming out. But anyway, isn't it? No? No. And they're all immediate must-reads. Today, his talk is a trope for modernization colonization.
Changes.
Yes, rewriting the Progressor narrative in post-Soviet science fiction. So,
Thank you so much, and thank you for organizing this conference. My paper has two epigraphs, one from the Strugatsky brothers and another from Valeria Novodvorskaya, which certainly, I guess, outlines the connection between the trope and its political resonance, so to speak. And in this paper, I wish to focus on the trope of the Progressor, obviously, an agent of a highly developed civilization secretly planted into the backwards of a repressive society, who tries not to interfere into the natural course of alien history, but attempts to help or alleviate the suffering of select representatives of the alien society, mainly intellectuals and typically his and always his beloved ones. The concept of the Progressor appears in the late Soviet period in the fiction of the Strugatsky brothers, and it appears as the central in a series of their novels as well as shorter texts, and so here I break it into two novels where we definitely can see the Progressor present and certain resonance of the Progressor motif, which is not central to the works, but obviously they are quite fixated on this theme. Surprisingly, the Progressor preserves its currency in post-Soviet literature, and although the Progressor's selfhood and strategy has undergone significant problematization in the late works of the Strugatsky brothers, I'll focus on the continuation of this process in post-Soviet literature. I'm arguing that the trope of the Progressor signifies the cultural dramaturgy of internal colonization, to use Alexander Atkins' term, and in this capacity it has become a form of imaginary self-identification for late Soviet and post-Soviet liberals who have been opposing the communist regime in the 80s and confronted authoritative as well as nationalist and neo-imperialist tendencies in post-Soviet politics. The figure of the Progressor, contemporary intellectual surrounded by a backward society, has provided a powerful trope for self-identification of the Soviet scientific intelligentsia, first and foremost, which was formed by the Soviet imperial project and naturally assumed an imperial position in the national context as well. The Foucauldian transformation of knowledge into power, symbolic and cultural in this case, serves as the most logical explanation for this phenomenon. According to Atkin, it is not racial, ethnic or political differences, but a cultural distance that predicates internal colonization. Quote, where there is no cultural distance, there is no colonial situation, end quote. In the Strugatsky's oeuvre, the issue of the cultural distance between the Progressors and the targets of their efforts constitutes the nexus of their genre and its artistic convention. On the one hand, the cultural distance is externalized. It is represented as a special distance between the communist Earth and other planets, and as the historical distance between the futuristic world of the Noon, to which Progressors belong, and the medieval, трудно быть богом, or totalitarian обитаемый остров, парень из преисподней, worlds they visit. While depicting distant realms subjected to the Progressors' activities, the Strugatsky brothers have been methodically saturating these chronotopes with motifs and realia, promoting the interpretation of these planets as socio-political metaphors of the Soviet world. Don Reba in Trudno быть Bogom as a slightly distorted anagram of Beria, the persecution of intellectuals, tortured chambers, and the fascist school in Trudno быть Bogom, the division of intelligentsia into hounded degenerates, dissidents, and well-paid yet suffering conformists, the mysterious transmitters of waves, which cause patriotic exaltation in some and horrible headaches in others, a transparent metaphor for the propaganda machine in обитаемый остров, and of course the concentration camps in numerous states. All these and similar motifs in their novels transform the distance between the planets into an ironic allegorical device, only emphasizing the internal vector of the quasi-sci-fi representation. In this context, the Progressor's alienation from his immediate historical environment arises as a powerful symbolic model for an enlightened Soviet intellectual confronted by a culturally distant social milieu. The sci-fi conventions essentialize cultural differences by presenting the unenlightened masses as literally aliens. Moreover, the Strugatsky progressors manifest the double orientalization aiming at both the masses and state power. From the standpoint of the progressor, the local authorities are just being dressed savages, while the repressed subalterns do not trigger any empathy in the progressor and the reader as well, due to their enthusiastic collaboration with the repressive forces. In the Strugatsky's novels, both the people and the power are marked by the lack of agency, while the progressor's agency drives the plot. The Strugatsky's progressor's agency stems from their commitment to the two basic principles of the Enlightenment: rationality, manifested by science, and humanism, manifested by their reluctance to use violence. In Trudno быть Богом, Romata's escape into violence is represented as morally ambivalent. However, it is obvious that his decision to kill, notably not through his high technology but with a sword, stems from his humanism. The clear division of the world into us and them begins to crumble in the Strugatsky's works of the 80s. If in the novels of the 60s it was obvious who they were, medieval barriers and the aggressive masses, in Trudno быть Богом, or the fathers with their propaganda machines, in the Обитаемый остров, in the novels of the 80s, the clarity of the category of the other becomes problematic. In Жук Муравейнике, a progressor Balkin, who is declared to be the other, is surrounded with the aura of compassion, while Rudolf Sikorsky, the head, and by the way, it's another interesting name, the head of the Progressor's Bureau, who defends us and our independence, repels the narrator. Thus, binary is foundational for the progressive discourse, appear destabilized, and this destabilization resonates with the shift of the progressor's focus from the transforming the environment to preserving his own identity. In other words, the progressor becomes more and more concerned about not becoming like them, rather than about changing them and improving their lives. The danger of becoming like the masses is associated with their fatalism and passivity, while an alliance with the powers predicates conformity. But either of these options implies the acceptance of violence. In fact, these two scenarios directly correlate with the roles scripted by the imperial discourse. By avoiding the gravitation to the masses and authorities, progressors try to chart the path between the position of imperial power and a colonial subaltern respectively. They wish to avoid both and yet remain colonizers. Colonizers liberators, colonizers enlighteners. I'm sorry for this very brief recap of the progressive motif in the Strugatsky. Of course, it deserves closer attention, but I just don't have time for that, and moving to the post-Soviet works. The activity of the progressive trope in the post-Soviet period testifies not only to the continuity between the imperial situation of the 60s, 80s, and the post-imperial situation of the 90s, 2010s. It also reflects various meanings of the post-prefix. In other words, a diversity of vectors transforming the rhetoric of modernization based upon cultural distance and entailing internal orientalization. As I will attempt to demonstrate further, despite certain differences between the representation of progressors in the works of such dissimilar artists as Alexei German, Dmitry Bykov, Viktor Pelevin, and Sergei Lukyanenko, one structural feature unites all progressors, progressor-like characters created by them. Post-Soviet progressors appear not only as the model of cultural/symbolic power justified by cultural distance from the masses, but also as a compensatory fantasy of the late Soviet and post-Soviet intelligentsia lacking access to actual political power. Also, the progressor functions as the switch between the imperial and colonial rhetorical models, between the external and internal, between the position of an enlightening power and the position of a repressed subaltern. One may isolate, in my perception of course, three main approaches to the progressor in post-Soviet culture. One, the progressor is heroized as a tragic figure, signifying the nostalgia for lost historical opportunities, and more specifically for the lost connection with the spirit of enlightenment and humanism. Two, the figure is relativized and emerges as a metaphor of the intelligentsia's psychological mechanism of coping with historical cataclysms. 3, the Progressor is satirized as the manifestation of the Western cultural or political colonization of Russia. The finale of Alexei German's filmed version of Trudno быть Bogom presents the heroization of the Progressor in the most direct and impressive way. It radically differs from the Strugatsky's novel ending. In the text of the novel, as we all remember, Romata returns to the earth, leaving Arkanar behind, and only red drops of strawberry remind of blood spilled by him. German concludes his 3-hour-long fresco with a snow-covered landscape contrasting with the dirt and mud of preceding scenes, with Romata moving in a sledge along the blindingly white scenery and playing something like a clarinet. The camera zooms in on his face and on which a smile of strange amazement bordering with insanity had been fixed. This finale hardly signifies the protagonist's liberation, and even if so, this is liberation through death, through departure from life with all its dirt and dismay. Alternatively, it may be read as the scene of Romatov's exile or escape from Arkanar, where he cannot stay anymore. In any case, this appears as a visual requiem to the Progressor and his attempts to be faithful to human values despite their inevitable defeat. According to German's visual logic, the Progressor's case had been lost before it started. However, Romata striving to act like an enlightened human being in the inhuman setting is a sign of a truly tragic character who acts as the one who possesses higher power while being aware of the fact that he can neither dominate nor improve this world, drowning in its own shit. Dmitry Bykov, who along with Akunin has become one of intellectual leaders of the protest anti-Putin movement since 2011, in his version of the Progressor aims to deconstruct the essentialist notion of the cultural distance, and by this means to get rid of tragic fatalism. It was Sofia Hagi, who is somewhere there, who first placed this novel into the Strugatsky's context, and I'm basically relying on her interpretation here. His novel, Bykov's novel Evacuator, 2005, at the first sight, reproduces a canonical plot of the Progressor narrative. A computer engineer called Igor, first jokingly and then more and more seriously, persuades his lover Katya that he is an emissary of the perfect civilization from a remote star system that has been sent to Earth as an observer and evacuator of select humans. Subsequently, he convinces Katya, along with 5 arbitrarily chosen strangers, to fly away in his spaceship from Moscow, which in the meantime slips into chaos caused by an avalanche of terrorist attacks. Since this moment in his narrative, Bykov has methodically been destroying all important components of the Progressor narrative. Firstly, the Progressor's native planet turns out to be as destroyed as Russia. Secondly, the Progressor and his beloved are followed by another spacecraft which brings a crowd of Katya's relatives and their friends from which she dreamt to escape. Thirdly, the community of strangers and relatives residing on a formerly perfect planet eventually outcasts Igor and Katya as unfit to their mundane needs and xenophobic worldview, forcing the lovers to fly away again. Finally, it turns out that the entire story of the interplanetary evacuation is a fruit of Igor and Katya's joint fantasizing while they spend the night together in expectation of the pre-announced large-scale terrorist attack on Moscow. Apparently, this sense of inevitable isolation and defeat of the Progressor remains intact, although Bykov reads the Progressor narrative both of the sense of cultural superiority. Katya and Igor are distinct from the others only by being in love and not by any prominent mental cultural merits, and the ensuing Orientalism. Instead of the essentialization of the cultural distance, Bykov presents the Progressor fantasy as a form of coping with a less and less controllable social reality. The fantasy that has been adopted by technical intelligentsia, both Igor and Katya belong to this social stratum, as a counterweight to social despair and helplessness. Thus, the motif of the Progressor's tragic doom, while preserved in Evacuator, in Bykov's interpretation stems from the fact that this trope manifests anything but symbolic power and cultural superiority of the intelligentsia. Rather, it compensates for the intelligentsia's post-Soviet transformation into new subalterns, manifested by their complete isolation from any means of power and any channels of influence onto post-Soviet society. Notably, post-colonial and post-imperial overtones are minimized in Bekov's novel. They become increasingly irrelevant when the Progressor gives up his mission of the enlightener and modernizer, choosing instead to save himself and his beloved ones from the impending catastrophe he cannot prevent or control. If all authors discussed above depict the Progressors as the embodiment of internal Russian phenomena, two extremely popular Russian writers, Sergei Lukyanenko and Viktor Pelevin, utilized this trope for the sci-fi representation of the West, or at least Western episteme, in its relation to Russia. Sergei Lukyanenko, famous by his watches, and Timur Bekmambetow's film, based on two of them, is a flaming Russian nationalist. While Pelevin is equally critical of Russian conservatives and liberals, but in his internet postings he consistently defends liberal views on current events. However, their satirical versions of Progressors surprisingly share some fundamental features. In his novel «Звезды холодные игрушки», 1997, Lukyanenko directly mocks the Strugatsky brothers' utopian world of the Noon, as the motherland of all Progressors, in his representation of the Geometers' Society. By the means of the Institute of Mentors, responsible for directing development of each individual, the Geometers uphold a hypercritical civilization, hiding strict control and psychological manipulations under disguise of friendship and loving care. These twisted principles are also define the Geometers' relations with other civilizations. Their Progressors are in fact regressors, that's the official name, whose goal is to degrade a foreign civilization so that the Geometers' society would be superior enough to dominate savages by its friendship, i.e. to establish imperial power of a colony. Numerous signals emphasized order, cleanliness, constant smiling, etc. indicate that by the Geometers, Lukyanenko means contemporary Western society, while his protagonist, Pyotr Khrumov, represents the rebellion of a colonial subaltern against Western cultural and political colonization. In fact, Lukyanenko's novel represents a blueprint for post-imperial nationalism that would be broadly adopted by Russian state media, orchestrating the annexation of Crimea and the conflict in eastern Ukraine. I guess Eliot will be talking about this more extensively in his talk. The imperialist methods of orientalization are turned against the West as an imaginary colonial oppressor, resulting with the West, and of course West here is, I will be tired to do this over time, is homogenized and demonized, and in this capacity presented as a symbol of hostile forces against which all Russia has to unify. Old-fashioned strategies of Soviet representation of the capitalist West merge here with a newly found conceptualization of Russia as a victim of the hidden colonial oppression. Lukyanenko's novel can be interpreted as a truly post-colonial, since its narrative clearly rejects the Progressor's perspective as repressive and evil. However, a closer look at its protagonist, a mouthpiece for the author, demonstrates that the imperial situation described above remains intact in the novel. Pyotr is not a progressor or regressor, he is a secret agent among the Geometers trying to reveal their secrets and expose their true intentions. Curiously, while penetrating into the Geometer society, Pyotr fuses in his body and mind three personae: himself, an earthling, Nick Rimmer, a Geometer's regressor, and a Qual, an amorphous creature who lives in a symbiosis with any other being. With Qual's help, Pyotr is able to reenact the Geometer not only physically but also genetically. At the same time, the creature equips the Earthling with supernatural resilience and physical power. In other words, while transforming Progressors and their community into a metaphor of creeping colonization of post-Soviet Russia by Western cultural domination, Lukyanenko depicts his protagonist, notably the Russian, as the synthesis of one colonial subaltern and two imperial regressor, connected by the powers of a perfect transformer / imitator / trickster. The structure of the subject suggests for Lukyanenko and his protagonist the post-colonial posing as a repressed subaltern is only a tactical means to gain power. Underneath the sheepskin of a subaltern hides an aggressor equipped with extraordinary mimicry and transformation facility. Sounds like contradiction, I guess. Simply put, the mask of a colonial subaltern within the logic of Звездные холодные игрушки is just a cunning trick in the imperial struggle for domination. Victor Pelevin is no less, if more, internationally acclaimed than Lukyanenko. Many novels have become a trademark of Russian postmodernism. In one of his recent novels, Snuff, 2012, recently translated into English, he deconstructs not only the figure of the progressor, but also the essentialized notion of the West that allegedly subjects Russia to cultural and ideological colonization. Pelevin depicts a futuristic world divided into two levels. On the surface of Earth reside the orcs, and that's Eliot's characters, inhabitants of Urkaina, the country's name is derivative of Urki, professional criminals in Russian prison argot, ordinary people whose agency is limited by a low level of technological progress, and an autocratic oligarchic political regime reminiscent of Russia and Ukraine in the 2000s. In artificial spheres like about the Earth resides a technologically advanced society of the big business. The spheres are inhabited by people, from capital P, and their life is controlled by a complex system of social codes and taboos promoting sexual tolerance, feminism, and consumerism, along with other Western liberal values, invariably depicted as repressive, hypocritical, and comedic. The worship of money too, a fusion of money and computer monitor, in a package with the people's paralyzing dependence on information technologies, even all the landscapes and spheres are computer simulations, completes Pelevin's satire of the West. The novel's protagonist, Danilola Karpov, a military pilot slash cameraman of CNews, a corporation that produces a mixture of news and fiction, collecting material predominantly in the worlds of orcs. Danilola is a parodic version of the Progressor. With his flying camera slash war machine, he supposedly saves two young lovers, Chloe and Grimm, from the repressive Urkanian regime and evacuates them to the culturally advanced and politically emancipated Big B. The parody can be seen not only in the fact that overweight Danilola operates his camera from his couch, literally, but also in a staged and fake nature of the saving, fabricated as a casus belli for the next war between the people and the orcs. Pelevin's novel, in certain ways, represents a more complex version of Lukyanenko's logic. Yet, if Lukyanenko epitomizes post-imperial nationalism, Pelevin constructs a situation of a new imperial exploitation based on the power of spectacles and simulacra rather than abuse of economic and human resources. In the course of the novel, the reader realizes that the entire civilization of orcs is an artificial product of the big business. The main justification for the existence of Urkaina lies in regular wars, wherein people use machines and elaborate cinematic monsters as their proxy, and orcs appear armed with medieval weaponry and dressed in colorful Hollywood-like outfits. In fact, each war taking place in this specially designed circus is a huge film production, recorded by numerous flying cameras during which the orcs shed real blood and died by thousands. For the hyperreality of simulacra, epitomized by the big beast, the wars with the orcs serve as an irreplaceable source of truth, or in the big beast lingo, snuffs, real dreams and real sex. War serves as the background of the production of porno films used for men to worship. In short, Urkaina supplies the big beast with the main material for the further constructions of hyperreality. The process of adaptation of two saved orcs, Chloe and Grimm, to the big beast's culture constitutes one of the novel's narrative lines. Chloe easily assimilates and eventually turns her pretty face into a face of the war, while Grimm, despite getting an enviable position of the content sommelier who is supposed to imitate the rough orc's truth, repels constant simulations and eventually returns to Urkaina. A story of another subaltern, Danilola's sex doll Kaya, serves as a parallel and supplement to the orc's narrative. Highly intellectually advanced, Kaya proves to Danilola that in the hyperreality of contemporary civilization, there is no difference between her, a smart rubber doll, and him, a war pilot and her owner. Their philosophical conversations, paired with the depiction of the big beast's snuff dependence on its colony Urkaina, suggest that the dichotomy between the master and subaltern, as well as between the empire and its colonies, becomes highly irrelevant in a society dominated by images rather than substances, by simulations rather than reality. The plot's development serves as the visible proof to this argument. Kaya, due to her highly developed intellect and emotional complexity, acquires agency, which de Miola calls its bitchiness, and falls in love with Grimm. Eventually she manages to escape from Damilola and join Grimm in the remote part of Ukraine. Damilola is ruined both morally and financially. Before leaving, Kaya empties all his accounts and he still has to continue paying an outstanding debt for purchasing her. Furthermore, the escape of Kaya and Grimm happens at the moment when the control of the Big Biz over the Hyrcanian autocracy is also shaken and the Big B sphere is doomed to fall on the Earth's surface. As a result of this, a new war between the people and the orcs is about to start, although in this war the people will have to fight according to the orcs' rules, which spells the inevitable defeat of the masters. As we can see, the progressor in post-Soviet culture signifies mutual interconnectedness and transformability of seemingly incompatible positions, one based on the imagined or real cultural and sometimes political superiority, and another with on imagined or real external or internal subalternity. Thus, this cultural trope in many ways epitomizes the nature of late Soviet post-colonial mimicry, representing, to use Homi Bhabha's formulation, the sign of a double articulation, a complex strategy of reform, regulation, and discipline, which appropriates the other as it visualizes power. End quote. Nevertheless, the representation of the progressor in post-Soviet culture in a diapason from a heroic, self-sacrificial victim to an overweight visual manipulator and evil regressor proves that this trope in Russian culture of the last 50 years has epitomized power relations associated with the ideology of modernization. Changing social and cultural attitudes to various models of modernization produce different versions of the progressor. However, despite all variations, the progressor invariably continues to conceptualize modernization as decolonization, which inevitably problematizes both the process, its goals, methods, and most importantly, its price. Finally, the progressor suggests a tangible and symbolically rich example of the formation, deformation, and transformation of the Soviet subjectivity, or more specifically, its peculiar type that has been shaped in the atmosphere of the thaw, distinguished by enthusiastic hopes for a fusion of Soviet communism with modernization based on the ideas of enlightenment and humanism about which Yvonne just talked. The progressor provides a symbolic documentation for this subject's historical mutations, resulting from the failure of the thaw period hopes. In other words, the progressor and its evolution stands for the self-reflexive representation of Soviet liberals as a mirror into which they looked and continue to look while trying to detect what has gone so wrong and why. Thank you so much.
Thank you. We have time for some questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Mark. Great paper, as usual. My question is, to what extent do you think that this evolution of the progressor into the regressor that you've outlined so clearly is already apparent, already evident, already existing in the Strugatsky's own works?
There is a potential for this, of course, and that's a very important question because if we read, or rather we read, of course, Strugatsky's works since the 80s, as I mentioned, the bifurcation point is Zhuk Muravinki, where we have actually three kinds of progressors, right? We have Rudolf Sikorsky, who becomes the KGB, right? We have Leva Balkin, who sort of becomes the victim, so progressor splits into the figure of power and the figure of persecution, being persecuted, right? And there is Maxim Kammerer, also the former progressor, right, who sort of tries to take the sides and eventually takes the side of Abalkin, as we recognize it by reading the novel. Then there is a very, very strange and still, I guess, waiting for its translation and interpretation, a novel Grada Brichenny, the one that they were writing through the 70s, and published only in the 90s, where we see the entire society, the society of progressors, and of course it constantly plays with the idea of the Soviet experiment as being the sort of the progressor's mission. And here all these functions are being sort of step by step taken by the central character who is at first repressed, then he's becoming sort of co-participant in the fascist coup, then he becomes Soviet, quasi-Soviet bureaucrat, etc., etc. So here it all breaks into multiple positions. And then we read in commentaries to collected works of Strugatsky that they were conceiving the novel under the tentative title Белый ферзь, where they were sort of returning to I forgot the name of the planet of обитаемый остров, Saraksh, thank you so much. Saraksh, and where sort of the architecture of this world is quite telling, because sort of here there are three circles, but what interests us is that the central circle is saved, very much protected, sort of guarded community, protected for enlightened, humanistic, civilizationally advanced sort of results of progressors' effects and progressors themselves, who live in surrounding of horrible chaos, repression, etc., etc. So basically gated community of colonizers who protect their Enlightenment values, but without any attempts to interfere with the world around them, but protecting their sort of intellectual dignity, which this design reads as a parody, and Boris Strugatsky himself commented on that probably it's a verdict to the entire, the sentence sort of to the entire generation, and it sounds suspiciously, although they couldn't know about this, suspiciously similar to the evolution of these advanced intellectuals from the prehistoric generation into the new oligarchs living in the gated community and collecting beautiful works of Russian avant-garde, as we just learned from the exhibition in Neue Gallery, right? From the collection of Piotr Avin. So that's the logic that they had discovered. The problem here, however, and there were also some kind of bifurcations. They were thinking about the sort of pedagogical utopia and teacher-student relationship, which were explored in Гадкие лебеди. And Sonia also wrote how Гадкие лебеди are being mocked by Garros in his Чучхе, which is very similar and but turned upside down. So indeed it was a very dynamic process. It was not a stable figure, but what I'm trying to say that for this sort of most, first of all, the largest and the most advanced, most politically active group of Soviet intelligentsia, the technical scientific intelligentsia, the progressors gave the formula. The progressors gave sort of the self-identification model. Consciously or not, I don't know, but the fact that if you speak with the computer engineer from former Soviet Union, he and again that's typically he would necessarily cite Strugatsky by heart. It is saying something to us, I guess. Yes, sorry.
Just for your little vignette to your here. I was talking yesterday to my mom, who's typical science person, Dr. Nauk, physics, 88 years old, and I'm telling her I'm going to this conference about and Strugatsky and sci-fi will be part of it. And just please remember everything because I want to know. Strugatsky is my favorite.
So I'm wrong.
Yeah.
I'm wrong. Saying here, I'm in a way reacting to what to this part of Ulitка на склоне, to which Yvonne mentioned in her paper with the citation from Mezhuev, which in my reading manifests the limits and very much anti-liberal flip side of this version of liberalism that Strugatsky's and this entire sort of worldview promoted.
We have time for one more question.
Yvonne?
Well,
Go ahead, whoever is going ahead, go ahead.
I don't have a question. I found this really interesting thing back in their commentary, where he talks about the kind of the origin of this progressor idea, where Buddy's it's still in the 60s, like he's fairly young, he's working for Pulkova, and he tells the story about he's sent on an expedition to Soviet Central Asia to survey possible sites for an observatory, and then they ask him to provide an introductory lecture about astronomy to some of the local workers, right? And then he says in the commentary, he gave this little lecture. Two of the people he's talking to, two of them look at me blankly, seeing no difference between a planet and a star. The other one insists the Earth is flat and circled by the sun. He said these people went through 10 years of schooling, right, in Soviet schools, and to him this was just a moment, like this sense of like they're just complete aliens in some way, right? I mean, he just sees this huge gap, and that's back in the early 60s. And they start writing all these books, and clearly by the end of their lives, I mean, the whole idea is in a crisis then, because there's something so also undemocratic. I mean, it is, well, like you said, I mean, I love your talk, yes, it just, everything, it splinters off, and the progressor just doesn't hold anymore.
Thank you, man. That's a great commentary, and I don't know how I missed it, but in this commentary, what draws attention, that it is already inscribed into the colonial framework.
Mm-hmm.
So he's going to Uzbekistan, which is sort of remote colony, and of course people there are backwards, and certainly they believe that the Earth is flat, and that's this idea of cultural distance, which is of course broader than just relation between Leningrad or Moscow to the periphery of the Soviet Empire, is indeed already loaded with colonial overtones and colonial superiority. We are people from another planet, we are people from another episteme, right? We have to survive there, what can we do? So, and then there are several, of course. Progressive basically explore all possibilities. We can educate, or we can't, right? We can save select people, or we can't, right? We can fight against them, or we can. And all this, and they try all scenarios, and all these scenarios end with catastrophe. And my feeling is that they end in catastrophe because they are based on the wrong foundation. Because they're based on the colonialist perception. And that's sort of the dynamite that explores in the process of realization of this program. With all my love to students.
Well, thank you. This is a great presentation. You also make me feel better about how little time I spend on behaving. So compensation.
Excuse me. Yeah, how could you know how I could log in the device to the
And we see it here further. Oh, wait, there we go. Okay. It's decided to work. All right. So, anyway, I'm not going to introduce myself quite so formally as I'm Eliot Borenstein. I'm here. So this talk is part of my book in progress, Plots Against Russia, which I'm writing and serializing in real time on my blog, plotsagainstrussia.org. I'm in chapter 1 right now. And what the talk I have today is a shorter and less conspiratorially focused version of chapter 5. So you're getting a preview of something that's not going on the web for many months. So you're meeting the tens of people who are reading now with this talk today. So, without further ado, okay, we got it? Good. All right. So, I want to start with a few quotes from Gandalf. There are older and fouler things than orcs in the deep places of the world. What has become of the miserable orcs, said Legolas. That I think no one will ever know, said Gandalf. And what can you expect from orcs? 50 Davids? No. Okay, so moving on to part one here. And today I'm actually talking less about science fiction and fantasy per se than I am about their circulation in a sort of politicized version of what we might call fandom. Okay, so politics, like fantasy and science fiction, is the art of creating and selling an imaginary world. It can be the world yet to come. Stalin called on his people to create a radiant future. Bill Clinton built a bridge to the 21st century, as if we wouldn't have gotten there without one. And Reagan's Morning in America promised the optimism of a brand new day. It can just as easily be a restoration of past glory. Milosevic proclaimed a return to Serbian purity. Putin, after saving Russia from an imagined imminent dismantling, is restoring his country to great power status. This picture works for everything. After years of humiliation. And closer to home, we are regaled with promises to make America great again by the man Esquire magazine termed a vulgar talking yam. Particularly telling, that's definitely fantasy, turning into horrible reality. Particularly telling is the increasingly frequent application of the American term paleoconservatism to Putin's program. Paleoconservatism, like the paleo diet, connotes a return to a Stone Age informed less by archaeology than it is by Clan of the Cave Bear. Linking one's politics to a purely fantastic world is but a simple step. Today I bring you word of a small but vocal community of Russian patriots who voluntarily, if ironically, proclaim that Russia is not, as the old Soviet jokes go, the motherland of elephants, but rather the homeland of orcs. Through a philologically suspect reading of J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, this community has appropriated the trilogy's largest contingent of villains in defiant response not just to the Manichaeism of Tolkien, but to the equally primitive binaries of the Cold War and its aftermath. Though it is the result of a clever and subversive appropriation of the tools of postmodernism, the identification of Russians with orcs is not deconstructive. Even when the same Tolkien references are used by the liberal opposition, the inherent dualism remains undisturbed. Productive irony cannot save either group from the fact that they are simply reversing Cold War binaries rather than undermining their foundations. This tacit acceptance of dualism is consistent with the source material. J.R.R. Tolkien has been accused of many things, but subtlety is not among them. Nor is there even the faintest whiff of moral relativism in his most famous works. We have in Lord of the Rings a famously complex fantastic geography, history, and ethnography, in which all of the forces of good just happen to have languages and cultures with clear Anglo-Saxon roots, while the dark and savage enemy offers little resistance to familiar racist Oriental tropes. And this is a truism in Tolkien studies. The very fact that Middle-earth contains evil races is at the very least problematic, and something that haunts a lot of low-rent science fiction. FNSF practitioners as varied as Michael Moorcock, David Brin, and China Nievel take Tolkien to task for his nostalgic feudalism and displaced racism. Brin points out that the urge to crush some demonized enemy is old and deep, and satisfied too easily by Tolkien. Of particular concern are the orcs. It is one thing to condemn the negative depiction of the other when the reader can safely identify with the hero, that is, the implied self. But what happens when the most alien, most other characters, by virtue of plot, description, and world building, provide an unexpectedly easy platform for identification by those who are not part of the initial target audience? So we're going on to part two. The story of Russia's orcs has roots both deep and shallow. Deep in that they stretch back almost to the beginning of Russian Tolkien fandom, and shallow because Tolkien's work arrived in the former USSR with a significant delay. There's a long history that you can read about the translation, so on and so forth, but it would only be in the last days of Perestroika that an abridged version was finally published, though lots of different versions have been circulating, with a full edition brought out a year after the Soviet collapse. As a result, Tolkien's reception in Russia is distinguished by two important features. First, in a country with a history of distrust of subcultures, Tolkien fans, or Tolkienisты, were greeted with suspicion by the media and Russian Orthodox Church, where Tolkien is treated as yet another foreign sect that threatened Russian traditions. Second, and more important for our purposes, the timing of Tolkien's Russian fame facilitated political readings of The Lord of the Rings. In a 1997 article in Nezavisima Gazeta, Yvonne Sliptsov wrote, The Lord of the Rings is, among other things, a political pamphlet in which Tolkien included an encoded description of the conflict of the political darkness of the East and the freedom of the West, and a prediction of the inevitable fall of Mordor and its analog on the real Earth, the Soviet Union. While such a reading is not unknown in the West, it does suffer from some less than creative anachronism. The Lord of the Ring was written between 1937 and 1949. A British citizen writing during this period had a much more obvious model for the embodiment of evil than Stalin's Soviet Union, which was also fighting on its side. Thus, the equation of Sauron with Hitler and his dark hordes with the Nazis seems far more likely, if still reductive, and it is a comparison that is easy to find in English language writings about Tolkien's trilogy, even if Tolkien rejected it. Still, this is an interpretation that is much easier to dismiss thousands of miles away from Moscow with a self-satisfied assurance that comes from reading Tolkien in its more or less native quasi-Anglo-Saxon linguistic and cultural milieu. But we should not be so quick to dismiss the Russia as Mordor idea, if only because all of Russian culture during the perestroika years and the decades that followed cannot be understood without the creative anachronism that came with the return of both Western and pre-revolutionary culture after the removal of censorship. Freud, Spengler, Weininger, Lombroso, Fyodorov, and Platonov were all contemporaries of the last Soviet generation and its children, taking on a relevance that they might arguably lack without Russia's 20th century experience of rupture and return. Why then shouldn't Tolkien be equally timeless in an equally odd fashion? More important, we cannot dismiss popular reading strategies simply because of their faulty grasp of history. Misreading is a crucial part of the fantasy experience. Even when the worldview is simplistic, the allegorical potential of fantasy, the fantasist's tendency to extrapolate their secondary worlds based on recognizable cultures and historical events, and the intensity of the emotional and imaginative investment by fan communities means that these fictional worlds are serious business. Moreover, the real-world parallels to events and situations in secondary worlds can, once again, thanks to fan identification, take on political and ideological baggage that may not have been intentionally packed by the story's creators. If, for example, the greed and cowardice of Star Trek's diminutive, big-nosed Ferengi are reminiscent of anti-Semitic stereotypes, but are in no way actually identified with Jews on the show, is there reason to take offense? Now, if this question strikes you as trivial or absurd, then you clearly haven't been spending enough time in the appropriate subreddits or comment sections where this issue is still alive after a few decades. What many Russian fans are recognizing is something akin to the experience of minority readers and viewers in the West, which is totally ironic given how hostile the same people I'm talking about are to minority discourses. We're talking about a limit to the possibilities for identification provided by a work of mainstream or majority entertainment. The heroes do not look like them, whether it is a matter of physical appearance, and really, how many of us want to admit a resemblance to hobbits? We may very well have, or of culture and values. The minority or liberal subject position here is not a neutral interpretive strategy. For the reader who feels un or misrepresented, the result can be a sense of empowerment or reclamation. For the majority reader who is used to seeing himself, and I do use that quite specifically, seeing himself properly representative wherever he looks, this can seem like a politicized misreading. See the crusade in right-wing science fiction circles against the so-called social justice warriors, a crusade that nearly ruined last year's Hugo Awards.
Did ruin.
Huh?
It did ruin.
It started, as they say, a conversation. Yes, it ruined it. But it was interesting. In the cases of Tolkien's Evil East, we are more than likely dealing with the unintended consequences of under-examined cultural bias. But what is noteworthy about the case of Russian reactions to Tolkien is the persistent claim of Tolkien's Russophobic intent. The equation of works with Russians is then an example of a paranoid reading. The author is out to get Russia. The paranoid reading of Tolkien begins as playful revisionist fan fiction, and is developed more fully in Nick Perumov's unauthorized Tolkien sequel series, The Ring of Darkness. But the clear moment in the sun for Russian orcdom was the 1999 release of Kirill Yuskov's The Last Ringbearer. Yuskov, a professional biologist and avowedly amateur novelist, exposes Tolkien's account as a work of elvish propaganda. Mordor, it turns out, is a beacon of rationality and enlightenment besieged by the dying and decadent forces of magic. In other words, the orcs, who are now simply another human ethnic group, are the good guys. Gandalf is a spell-casting Hitler looking for the final solution to the Mordor problem. And Saruman is the only wizard smart enough to realize that he's been on the wrong side all along. Yet if the political overtones of The Last Ring Bearer are relatively restrained, final solution reference is excluded. That was a quote, by the way. I didn't make that one up. The novel reinforces a political reading that some in the West might find baffling. Baffling but brilliant. Internet users in the orbit of the Librepunk subgenre of Russian science fiction, which is dystopias in which the world has gone to hell thanks to the triumph of liberalism and tolerance, this is chapter 4 of my book, have reappropriated not just Tolkien, but the simplistic pop culture-inspired metaphysics of American exceptionalism as articulated by Ronald Reagan and extended and not articulated by George W. Bush. Fine, they say, we'll be your evil empire. But we'll do it with an irony and pride that you'll never quite comprehend. The logic reaches its apotheosis in Book 3 of Maxim Kalashnikov's and Yuri Krupnov's 4-volume paranoid rant, America versus Russia, which he gives the title The Rage of the Orc, Yavorka, in 2002. Kalashnikov and Krupnov, and I tend to just refer to as Kalashnikov because he's the more famous one, he's the motor of all of this, dismiss the common perception, I like this, the common perception, like, what do you think about orcs? The common perception that the orcs are supposed to represent Muslims. Remember that remember that the orcs are Easterners in Tolkien's Western consciousness. After excerpting several pages of descriptions of orcs from The Lord of the Rings, they simply assert the connection is obvious. Can you feel it? Tolkien's somnolent mysticism is about us. The hundreds of years of slavery, the pathological animal cruelty, the disdain for death, and the clinical incapacity for the market and democracy. It's all there. The time has come to understand that for the West, we've always been and will always be, unless the best people in the West change their consciousness, those revolting, savage orcs, those barbarians for whom the earth has no place. Kalashnikov's and Krupnov's miniature orc manifesto is breathtaking in the scope of its projection. If Tolkien's depiction of the orcs resembles the author's imagined slanderous depiction of Russians, then Tolkien is speaking about Russians. When they boldly take on the orc mantle as an act of subversive appropriation, the objects of their rebellion start to lose focus. They assume the identity of a famous group of villains in order to spite the authors of this Russophobic calumny, but those authors are the same as the author of the entire book, Kalashnikov and Krupnov. The equation between Russians and orcs is all but unknown in the West. I'm helping now. But it spreads in Russia largely through the efforts of those who claim to be offended by it. This isn't just self-colonization, it's self-orientalizing. Kalashnikov and Krupnov complete this process when they proclaim that they, like Alexander Blok, are willing to say, and if not, we have nothing to lose and we are capable of betrayal, we will turn our Asiatic faces towards you. Yes, orcism turns into a variation of idiosyncratic Eurasianism through the quotation of Blok's famous poem, Skifi, the Scythians, almost in its entirety, yes. Later in the book, the authors justly condemn George W. Bush for his Manichaean worldview, yet this is a description that suits the rage of the orc even better. Any plot structure with two sides, one of which is said to be civilized and the other barbaric, becomes available as a mode of Russian self-representation. If the appeal to literary fantasy might seem to cheapen ideological discourse, then from my point of view, this is a job well done. While the comparison of a classic poem by Blok to Lord of the Rings fan fiction is troubling on aesthetic grounds, I like this poem, it exposes the fantasy inherent in ideological claims of primordialism. After all, how much did Alexander Blok know about the actual Scythians when he wrote this poem? How much does anyone? What starts out as popular ethnography ends up as ideological cosplay. Kalashnikov's book has been cited as the likely origin of the Russian orc roulette meme, but the search for a point of origin might be as much an exercise in fantasy as the primordialism I've just condemned. Like all internet memes, it spreads digitally with no need of an original. While there are numerous essays and blog posts about the hidden Russophobia in Tolkien's orcs, it took one notorious live journal personality to make orcism a key part of one of his many manifestos. Vladimir Yuryevich Frankov, the Aryan nationalist most famous first as Yerovrat, then as Heidig. After, you guys know him? Yes. Well, here he is. He doesn't want to know you. After a long and tortured explanation about the difference between the Rus, the powerful hypermasculine wolf man responsible for all of Russia's victories and for the very nature of the Soviet Union, and the Ruski, a slave, that which belongs to Rus, an explanation that rejects Europe in favor of Northwest Asia and Eurasia in favor of Sakharazia, Yeravrato Heidegger, which is short for Heidegger, yes, something should be short for Heidegger, declares that the true Russian ideology is orchism. This is the best of three possible paths for Russia. Okay. У русских три пути: либо пиздоболие, либо self-hate, либо архизм. Пиздоболие, мы не орки, мы эльфы. Self-hate, мы орки, надо стать эльфами. Архизм, мы орки и слава мокоши. Yeravrat's protestations to the contrary, I would submit that the line between argism and self-hate is somewhere between thin and non-existent. If we keep in mind the frequent use of orc as sarcastic self-reference in comment sections, usually referring to the West's disdain for the savage and unrefined Russians, then the orc's true identity becomes clear. The orc is the latest incarnation of the Savok, the Soviet yokel whose lack of civilized habits of thought and behavior was a source of simultaneous embarrassment, humor, and even pride. But the orc is not merely a fantasy-inflected post-Soviet update of the Savok. The orc is the Savok weaponized. Unlike the Savok, however, the orc is not a symbol of a multinational Soviet state. Thus its true identity is up for grabs. In Snuff, which will come on in a moment, yes, in Snuff, sorry, Viktor Peryevin, who has yet to recover from an addiction to cheap wordplay, exploits the overlap between the words orc, Urka, and the first syllable of Ukraina, as Mark explained, to connect the orc to Ukraine. The connection is unsurprisingly superficial, as the primary satiric target of the novel seems to once again be Russia and, of course, the West. Since the outbreak of hostilities in Ukraine, however, orc has evolved further. Now that the Ukrainians are ukropy, the presumably savage, warlike Russian invaders are, of course, orcs. Leonid Bershitsky recalls that as far back as 2012, his colleagues in Kiev joked that Ukraine was much like the Shire, the Hobbit's home country, while Putin's Russia was Mordor, working its evil magic on the bucolic land. He inevitably compares Putin to Sauron and notes that the Russian president's repressive machine is run by orcs. So let's bring to my conclusion, Zapad nam pomoże. The tale of the Russian orc is more than simply a chronicle of the Russification of a Tolkien meme. It is the tale of a national ideological implotment based on a set of resistant paranoid reading strategies. The Lord of the Rings becomes available at a key historical moment, and is such a powerful narrative that Russian audiences find their own story encoded within it. The valences of the story are, by the 1990s, sadly familiar. An evil empire has been thwarted by the forces of good. A Russocentric reading of The Lord of the Rings would have to be self-hating, at least in the initial stages. But a resistant interpretation of the book gained popularity at the same time as resentment of the so-called forces of good, the US and Europe, increased. Just as the once earnest perestroika and post-perestroika refrain, Zapad nam pomožet, the West will help us, could only be uttered with bitter irony, Lord of the Rings showed some Russian readers just how devastating Western help could be. But the greatest irony is the one that always surrounds Russian ideological rejections of the West. The orc identity imagines rejection by the West, only to turn the orc into an imaginary weapon against the West. But the vocabulary employed was nonetheless developed by an eccentric European dreaming his elvish dreams in a study in Oxford. Thank you. So we have time, yes.
So from this phrase, one of the variants, right? We are orcs. We must become elves. That suggests that the West is identified with the elves,
yes.
Right? Because I was just wondering, I mean, say, why not with the hobbits or the people or dwarves or any other, race in Tolkien's universe? Given especially that the elves seem to be dwindling away in Tolkien, right? So they are not clearly the winning force, but they are more like medieval type aristocrats who are being ousted by humans. So is this Russian orcish narrative imagining the West precisely in terms of elves or someone else in Tolkien?
That's an excellent question. Yerovrat is the only one I've seen specify elves, which could just mean another sign that, as you're suggesting, he's not a greatest reader of Tolkien. Or maybe, what I'm assuming is that that in his interpretation, the elves are embodying a particular ideal. And then actually the fact that they're dying also works, because as we know, the West is rotting and dying. And I mean, that's actually what you get from Skifle, that's what you get from Orkir, the updated version. So that actually could work. But in most of the stuff where I see Orkir online, in comment sections, so on and so forth, the Tolkien metaphors are restricted to Orkir, Sauron, and Mordor. There's no, the rest of it, I mean, Dershitsky mentions the Shire, but for the most part what I see is really just focused on those.
So it's very binary reading.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's sort of methodological self-identification, as you showed, self-orientalizing. But my question is, how does it relate to the previous similar identification with the Nordic stuff, with Vikings, Varangians, and from what you quoted, so you mentioned that the same guy who argues the Orkim, that he's also arguing about Rus, Vikings. So is it just the transformation of Varangians into orcs, or are these ideologies different? And if this is the transformation, then what does it demonstrate? And if they're different, how?
Okay. That's great. I mean, I think it is to some extent a transformation, especially for Yerovrat. But what's also worked here, and this is something I've seen videos online, I've seen references, and I haven't found a good source discussing this, and I'm sure people that someone might be able to help me with this. There's this whole weird, judgmental, but I'll say it, weird school of historiography that's sort of pop historiography philosophy in Russia based on really bad etymology. About Svet and stuff like, the video of the woman blathering on about Svet and God and so on and so forth. And it's spread enough that suggests to me not so much a movement, but several vectors of transmission. And that same kind of logic, if you call it, playing with etymology, is something that Yerovrat is doing as well. And ironically, that actually brings them closer to Tolkien, because except that Tolkien knew what he was doing. In terms of roots and so on and so forth. But I think a missing link in here is precisely this approach to history, which I have not researched.
Yeah, so I have this colleague who's in classics department, who's like a linguist, who a few years ago was, before all this stuff happened, was invited to Kiev. He was somehow teaching there for a year or something like that. And that was the thing he came with, completely astounded him. He said there are these large, research projects, right, that have to do with unearthing these kind of etymological basis of completely alternate historical kind of trajectories of what happened. But it's considered science.
By some, but it's also put online to laugh at too. So it's
people are doing it.
There are people who are doing it, and it's only as I'm speaking to you now that oh god, I need to research this because it's just been in the back of my mind. If you know of anyone who's working on this, and could save me work, that would be great. Yes.
Yeah. Well, actually, I was thinking in taking it back to the Lord of the Rings universe. Then also, does any of these fanfics or fandoms pick up on the difference between the orcs, because there are different races and then they fight between them? So in this orcism, is it we orcs very unified we, or are there differences also among them?
So in stuff like Yuskov and so on and so forth, where they really are concerned with world building, then you will see actual attention to orc life and orc ethnicities and orc folkways would be like that etymology, it's perfect. And so, because the concern really is doing what fantasy and science fiction often do really well, is making up something that's completely not true, but making it feel lived in. In this case, the possibility of different subgroups of elves. That's not what these other people I'm talking about are concerned with at all. For them, it's a rhetorical device. So they don't need to get into the difference between this group of elves and that group of elves, orcs. They don't need to talk about the Ents or anything else. They've got this and they just run with it. Yes.
Me?
Yeah.
It was just breathtaking presentation, and thank you so much. The question I would like to ask has to do with this self-identifications of Russians with orcs, and I think it's just wonderful. I didn't know about it, but it's very interesting. But don't you think that the question you are dealing with here is really a larger question? It's a question about self-identification of humans with non-humans.
Mm-hmm.
And as much as you can tell us here the story about Russian identifications with orcs, you can think about all kind of Tolkien fans in the West who would be doing very much the same. Or you can look at the vampire fans sites and see if there's young 13 years old kids who would write, I would give everything to become a non-human.
Oh, sure.
I would give up everything to become a vampire. In other words, what I'm kind of getting at is that I think they're living through a very specific cultural moment. This self-identification or identification with non-humans is becoming very prominent. But you are completely right, and to my mind what is absolutely crucial is that Tolkien stands at the very beginning of this whole movement because he was the first writer who actually put non-humans in the center of his epics, of the center of his imaginary universe, and made these non-human hobbits endorsed with all moral values. And that's very true. He was religious, he was a believer, and his hobbits inherited all the highest Christian morality one can imagine, but still they are non-humans. So what seems to me has happened since Tolkien is that this aesthetics he created took over the humanistic or religious or whatever values he wanted to embed in his narrative. And in this sense, to my mind, Tolkien is really a kind of father-founder of a contemporary, what I call Gothic aesthetics, of the contemporary aesthetics which dominates how humans perceive themselves nowadays and how they despise themselves.
No, that's excellent. But where I think the big difference comes is, yes, absolutely. I mean, fandom here, I'll just leave it in the States for now, but it's a global phenomenon, is enormous in role-playing and wanting to be a vampire, absolutely. But what is different, what I have not seen in American fandom at least, and what I know of European fandom, is is connecting all these fantasy creatures with the notion of your own nation. That there's actually, I've never seen preoccupation with my nation and vampires.
Oh yes, you have that among American vampire fans.
As it being about America?
Yes, as it being about kind of American culture.
Contemporary culture, but still, I would argue it's not
I mean,
quite
it's probably a little quite different from
Yeah.
what you shown here about orcs, but
Yeah.
you can get those same kind of nationalistic trends.
But in any case, it doesn't jump out at me, I would say. And what I think is one of the things that's operating differently is that, I think one of the things that you have the luxury of in America, at least, is not thinking of yourself in terms of the nation because it's all default and everything's American unless it's not, right? I mean, it's all underexplored, and nation might not even matter so much, which is exactly the sort of caricature of liberalism that people behind all of this really, really hate. Because what I see fantasy and science fiction serving so well to do and being appropriated really quite eloquently by a lot of fans, at least in the States and also in Europe, is taking advantage of science fiction and fantasy's potential to deal with alterity by coming up with other others. Because when we deal with our others in our world, we have all the baggage that comes with them. You know, this is why, you know, the original Star Trek does all this terrible ham-fisted stuff with, like, there's a planet with two races of people. They're black on one side and white on the other, and they're white on one side and black on the other. What could this be about, right? But but better science fiction, to be judgmental about it, better science fiction doesn't allow this to map on so easily, and then allows us to think about alterity in a way that is liberated from our reflexive associations with otherness now, but that then can be brought back into our discussion of otherness in the real world. Octavia Butler, for instance, does this extremely well. And so that is really a liberal agenda of this kind of science fiction and fandom, one that is completely, again, alien to all of this. Alien, yes. Yeah.
I have two questions. One of them is small and targeted, and the second one is maybe more involved. But the first one is that in the realm of Middle-earth, there is one group, and that's Gondor, that is right next to Mordor and is kind of morally ambivalent buffer state inhabited by people with Slavic names, like Boulder, right?
Yeah,
so
yeah.
I guess the first question is, does it even register? That in this like reconstruction of Europe circa 800, there's already a proto-Slavic element clearly identified and present in the text? And then the second question is, with this line, "Mój orki nadastat elfami," the tremendous irony for me there is that in Tolkien's mythology, the orcs are actually elves who have been perverted by Sauron and turned into orcs, right?
Yeah.
And this fits in for Tolkien with a gigantic criticism and hatred of industrialism and progress. The orcs, and especially the Uruk-hai, are created by what are recognizably industrial methods,
Yes.
and then they come and they take over the Shire and they destroy that. So I was wondering if there's a level in which we're not just talking about sort of an identification of a political entity in the real world with some kind of group in a fantasy novel, but if there's a precondition for that hatred, which has something to do with a denial of progress, of time, of the very idea of one thing turning into another thing, and if that somehow is present in Tolkien, but also undergirds this interpretation that you described.
That's excellent. First of all, I want to give you 100 geek points. Second, though, I think that what you're talking about, transformation, works for people in this world who are paying better attention. And also, Gondor comes up in the more scholarly version of this, but really, most of, I think, the stuff online that I'm talking about, they're reacting to the films. And the films, the films play such an important role. The films are the starting point for Переводы от Гоблина, right? Which is all about taking Western film and giving it a subversive, funny translation soundtrack. In a sense, that's the same project, but not necessarily for any particularly overriding political motivation, even though some of the riffs will be very national, but they don't necessarily add up to anything. And in the films, you just get less of this, right? I mean, it's visual. So I think that would be it. Okay, I think so. I think I have to cut myself off here. So now what we have is a combination of lunch and then eventually the keynote. The way I originally pictured this was that the keynote was going to be in the big room, but I think we're going to stay here. So the idea is we'll eat for a while, and Adita will eat faster than the rest of us, and then we will bring our food in here, and Anandita will give her presentation. But for right now, is the lunch here yet? Yes. I mean, it's arrived?
We've seen the movie.
Oh, you've seen it, right, okay. So everybody come have lunch. Okay. Thank you.